Mr. Krabs has spent over 25 years as the show's walking definition of what loving money too much looks like. Fans have always assumed his fortune was enormous, but the show's own YouTube channel once hired a real financial advisor to run the numbers, and what came back was far smaller than anyone expected. In this video, we break down how much money Mr. Krabs really has. The boy who was born broke Bikini Bottom has seen a lot over the course of 25 years on television. Superhero battles in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant, a stolen crown that nearly brought about the end of an underwater civilization, jellyfish conventions, pirate raids, sentient patties going rogue, time travel back to medieval oceans, and at least one incident involving a magic wishing well that the show never fully explained. Through all of it, across every wild deviation the series ever took from its own premise, one thing stayed fixed. Every episode morning, the Krusty Krab opens. SpongeBob shows up early, Squidward shows up late and miserable. Customers arrive, Krabby Patties leave, and money flows, reliably and in only one direction, into a set of large red claws attached to a crab who has been the show's most consistent financial presence from the very first episode to the most recent one. The question this whole video is built around sounds simple on the surface. How much money does Mr. Krabs actually have? But the moment anyone starts pulling at that question seriously, it becomes something far more tangled than a single number. The show gives contradictory answers across its own run, sometimes in episodes that aired only weeks apart. The official answer, produced with real financial expertise and attached to the show's own online presence, lands on a figure that most fans find surprisingly modest. The fan estimates built from combing through episode details land on numbers that are orders of magnitude larger. And underneath all of it, before any of the accounting can begin, there is a more fundamental question that the show's own writing raises again and again across decades of material. What is this money actually for? What is a crab who will sell an employee's soul for pocket change actually doing with the fortune he's been building his entire life? To get anywhere near an honest answer to those questions, the story has to start somewhere that has nothing to do with restaurants, secret recipes, or Krabby Patties. It has to start in a schoolyard, sometime in the 1950s, with a young red crab being mocked by the other children for the state of his clothes. Eugene Harold Krabs was born on November 30th, 1942, to a family whose financial circumstances left almost nothing behind for a child growing up in the years that followed. The show refers to this period of his life in scattered flashbacks and asides, rather than in any single dedicated origin episode, but the picture those references build is consistent enough to assemble into something coherent. The Krabs family, at the point when Eugene was young enough to be attending school, was poor in the specific way that follows children around and becomes visible to everyone around them, including the children who have no particular cruelty in them but still notice the difference. His clothing, according to the show's own canon, was assembled from material pulled out of a dumpster. That detail, dropped into an episode without ceremony, says a great deal about how far below the economic waterline the family was sitting during those years. Far enough that buying new clothes for a child was not a realistic option. The practical consequence of being the kid in dumpster clothes, in any school in any decade, is the same. Other children notice, and children at that age do not generally respond to visible poverty with charity. Eugene Krabs was bullied, excluded, and mocked by his classmates for being poor, and that experience, repeated across the years of school that are supposed to shape a person's sense of where they stand in the world, left a mark that the entire rest of his life runs on top of. The one notable exception to that pattern of exclusion was a small, green, one-eyed creature named Sheldon J. Plankton. The two shared the same birthday, were raised in the same circumstances, and were pulled together by exactly the logic that brings most childhood friendships into being: proximity and shared misfortune. Plankton was also poor, also excluded, and also looking for someone to sit with. The show revisits this early friendship across several episodes, and the portrait it draws is genuinely moving in ways the series does not always lean into. Two children who nobody else wanted to spend time with found each other, and for a stretch of years in Bikini Bottom, that was enough. What connected them was not just loneliness, but ambition. Both of them understood, in the way children from poor families often understand very early, that the life they were living was not the only possible version of a life, and that money was the specific mechanism by which one version became another. There is a moment from this period in Krabs' life that the show surfaces in a season 3 episode called My Pretty Seahorse. Delivered as a brief story, Krabs tells SpongeBob about his own childhood. At the age of 5, his father gave him a single dollar bill. The episode describes Krabs' feeling about that dollar in terms that sound almost absurd given the tiny denomination involved. He loved it. He treated it like something precious, like a companion, which makes a particular kind of sense when the context is a child who has been told by the visible world around him, by the the quality of his clothes and the reaction of his classmates, that his family has almost nothing. A dollar, held in the claw of a 5-year-old in those circumstances, is not a small thing. It is proof that money exists, and that it is, at least occasionally, something his family can touch. The story ends with young Krabs spending the dollar on a soda during one hot day at the beach, which sounds like exactly the kind of small, impulsive pleasure a child would spend their first dollar on, and which the adult telling the story still remembers with a weight that goes beyond the simple loss of a small coin. Plankton's role in shaping Krabs' specific understanding of money becomes clearer in a different flashback, this one from the Camp Coral prequel series, in which the two children encounter money in a more formal, more clarifying way. At a carnival, young Krabs discovers a penny. He is described as being amazed by it, holding it up, turning it over, in the specific way a child is amazed by something that feels meaningful before they fully understand what it means. Plankton, characteristically, steps in with information. He explains money to his friend, not in the abstract but as a system, a mechanism that determines the distance between the life the two of them were living and the kind of life they could see other people living around them. That moment, a penny in a claw, and a small voice explaining what pennies become when you accumulate enough of them, is as close as the show gets to showing the exact instant when Eugene Krabs' relationship with money hardened from a childhood preoccupation into something much more structural. The friendship between Krabs and Plankton broke apart in a way the show covers carefully across multiple episodes, particularly in the Season 5 entry Friend or Foe, which reconstructs the specific history of how two poor kids trying to build something together ended up as lifelong rivals instead. The short version is that both of them saw the same opportunity at roughly the same moment, the success of a nearby burger stand run by a character named Stinky, and both of them tried to build something that could compete with it. Their joint attempt at a burger poisoned their first customer, which is exactly the kind of disaster that ends a partnership quickly. The fight over the failed recipe and the subsequent accident that produced the formula that would eventually become the Krabby Patty pulled them in opposite directions permanently. Plankton walked away from that breakup with a single ingredient, a pinch of chum, which would go on to define the famously unpleasant food served at the chum bucket. Krabs walked away with everything else. What the show chooses to do with the period between that early business failure and the eventual opening of the Krusty Krab is notably fragmented, and the fragmentation is deliberate, because the different origin stories the show offers for the restaurant are not all compatible with each other. One version, introduced in the Season 3 episode Krusty Krab training video, says that Krabs converted a bankrupt retirement home called the Rusty Krab into the restaurant, painting a K over the R on the sign to create the name the building has carried ever since. Another version, surfaced in a separate episode, says the Krusty Krab was originally a pirate ship that Krabs himself captained. A third version ties the restaurant name back to a family lineage that stretches into medieval ocean history, with an ancestor called King Krabs apparently serving the Krabby Patty to underwater royalty centuries before Eugene Krabs was ever born. The pirate version is worth sitting with for a moment because it connects directly to another figure whose influence runs throughout Krabs' backstory. His grandfather, known in the show as Redbeard, was a pirate, and according to the episodes that cover this period, Krabs was sent to live with Redbeard at some point during his youth. The things Redbeard taught him were practical rather than philosophical, the skills of someone who had spent a life at sea acquiring things from other people and holding on to them through force of will and physical strength. Redbeard is also credited, in the show's canon, with one of the most defining statements in Krabs' personal mythology. The Grandfather's Code, which the show presents as something that stayed with Krabs into adulthood, was built around honesty, specifically around the principle that a pirate never lies. The irony of a man whose entire adult life involves creative deception about money, who charges employees for breathing, who renames a retirement home by painting over a single letter to save the cost of a new sign, carrying that principle from his grandfather, is something the show never draws direct attention to, but leaves sitting in the background of almost everything Krabs does. The show is not always consistent about when exactly Krabs joined the Navy, but the general picture places his military service at some point after the childhood period and before the restaurant years. What the Navy gave him, according to the various episodes that reference it, was a combination of physical training, cooking experience, and a specific kind of confidence that comes from being the strongest person in a given room. He earned the nickname Armor Abs Krabs from his shipmates, a title that implies he had, by this point in his life, shed whatever remained of the child who had been mocked for wearing clothes from the dumpster. He served on vessels with names that the show treats as jokes, working as a cook on ships where his food was one of the few reliable pleasures available to the crew around him. By the time he left the Navy and returned to civilian life, he was someone who knew how to feed people, knew how to lead a crew, and was carrying carrying decades of accumulated anger about poverty that had never really been resolved by any of what the Navy had given him. The deep post-service depression that several sources within the show reference is consistent with what the military career, followed by a return to civilian life without financial stability or a clear path forward, would produce. The man who came out of the Navy was not wealthy. He was experienced, capable, and profoundly motivated to never again be the child in the dumpster clothes. What he had access to, after the Navy, was just enough money to act on that motivation in a small way. A bankrupt retirement home in Bikini Bottom was sitting available, priced low enough that someone with very little could acquire it if they were determined enough, and he was. He bought it. He painted a letter. He had a recipe, inherited from a family lineage that stretched back further than most restaurants can claim, and he had the cooking skills to execute it. That was the complete inventory of assets available to Eugene Harold Krabs at the moment the Krusty Krab came into existence. The reason all of this background matters to a video specifically about money is that it establishes the specific relationship Krabs has with wealth before a single Krabby Patty was ever sold. His obsession with money is not the quirk of a character who started rich and became greedy. It is the obsession of a person for whom poverty was a public humiliation, visited on him during the years when humiliation sticks hardest, who spent his entire childhood understanding that the absence of money was the reason the other children had more power in his world than he did. The Krab who will later charge his employees for the air they breathe, who will sell an employee's soul to avoid a medical bill, who will spend an entire episode stalking a child for a penny he suspects might be hidden in the yard, is not acting out of pure theatrical villainy. He is acting out of a very old and very specific fear that losing money means returning to being the kid nobody wanted to sit with, the one wearing the dumpster clothes, the one standing outside looking at a penny and understanding that the gap between that coin and a real life was almost immeasurably large. Understanding that root does not make the behavior that follows any less absurd, or any less funny, or any less troubling in the later seasons, when the show pushes it past the point where it can still be played primarily for laughs. But it does change the frame through which the numbers in this video need to be read. Every dollar figure attached to Mr. Krabs, every wage paid or withheld, every suspicious accounting decision, every moment where he chooses a coin over a person, runs on top of this foundation. A boy who started with almost nothing, who built something real out of a bankrupt retirement home and a borrowed letter of the alphabet and a secret recipe that may or may not have been in the family for 8 centuries, and who spent the rest of his life making absolutely certain that the nothing could never come back. What he built, and how much of it there actually is where the story goes from here. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A childhood built on poverty and a borrowed letter of the alphabet became the foundation of Bikini Bottom's most successful restaurant. Next comes the question of what that restaurant actually pays, and the answer the show gives across 25 years turns out to be a different number almost every time someone asks. Section 2. The wage that changes every week payday. At the Krusty Krab is one of the show's most reliable setups for a joke, and the joke is always the same at its core. SpongeBob works, customers eat, money comes in, and then at some point someone asks what any of that work was actually worth to the person doing it. The answer, whenever the show chooses to give one, lands somewhere between insulting and genuinely difficult to believe. Across 25 years of episodes, the show has handed out a remarkable variety of answers to the same basic question: how much does Mr. Krabs pay his employees? And almost none of those answers agree with each other. Some of them contradict each other within the same season. Some of them are so far from any realistic figure that they function more as pure joke logic than any actual attempt at world building. And a small number of them, placed next to each other carefully, reveal something specific and consistent about how Mr. Krabs thinks about the people who make his restaurant work and what their labor is actually worth to him. Before getting to the wages themselves, there is a detail buried in one early episode that tends to stop fans cold when they encounter it, because it inverts the entire premise of the employment relationship at the Krusty Krab. In the Season 2 episode Big Pink Loser, Patrick becomes briefly inspired by SpongeBob's collection of awards and sets out to earn one himself. During a conversation between the two, SpongeBob mentions, without any particular emphasis or outrage, that when he first started working at the Krusty Krab, the arrangement ran not in the direction most people assume. Rather than being paid for his time, SpongeBob says he was charged $100 per hour by Mr. Krabs for the privilege of working there. When Patrick later tries to take the same job, the rate drops to $50 per hour, a concession Krabs apparently makes for a new hire with visibly less skill, though the logic of charging anyone for the chance to do your work for you is already so far outside any normal employment framework that the discount barely registers as meaningful. The episode treats this detail as a quick throwaway throwaway line, rather than an event requiring explanation or reaction from SpongeBob, which says something important about how normalized extraordinary financial exploitation has become in his relationship with his employer. That opening detail matters because it establishes, right at the edge of the show's own recorded history of the arrangement, that the standard rules of employment simply do not apply to the Krusty Krab in any meaningful way. What Mr. Krabs can and cannot do to his employees in terms of pay has never been governed by anything resembling the labor protections that exist in the real world, or even by the internal logic of Bikini Bottom's own apparently pro-capitalist legal framework. It has always been governed by one factor only: whatever Mr. Krabs decides he can get away with at any given moment. And what he can get away with, across 2.5 decades of the show's run, turns out to be quite a lot. The most famous number in the entire history of the Krusty Krab's wage disputes is a single coin. In the Season 9 episode SpongeBob You're Fired, which aired in 2013, the basic premise of the show gets temporarily reversed. Mr. Krabs, looking for a way to cut costs by the smallest margin imaginable, fires SpongeBob from a job the sponge has held for the entire run of the series. The reason given for the firing is financial. SpongeBob's yearly salary, according to the episode, is a nickel, and eliminating that nickel from the restaurant's weekly operating costs will, in Krabs' own calculation, put him far enough ahead to justify letting his most talented and devoted employee walk out the door. A nickel, 5 cents. For a full year of work, in a restaurant that would not function without the person being handed that coin. The episode plays the number for its intended comedic impact, and then builds a plot around SpongeBob finding temporary employment at a series of competing restaurants, each of which recognizes his talent immediately, while the Krusty Krab collapses without him. The nickel detail lands cleanly as a joke, but it is also a figure the show chose to put on record as the canonical annual compensation for the best fry cook in Bikini Bottom. What makes that number genuinely interesting is how it sits against other wage figures from different episodes in the same series. An earlier episode, Bummer Vacation from Season 4, builds its premise around Mr. Krabs being legally required to give SpongeBob a vacation because labor law apparently applies in Bikini Bottom when it is convenient for the plot. During that episode, Mr. Krabs holds up a dime, and SpongeBob's response is that the dime is already more than he makes in a year. A dime is 10 cents. If a dime exceeds SpongeBob's annual income, his yearly salary should technically be less than 10 cents, which would put the nickel from SpongeBob You're Fired at roughly twice his actual earnings rather than the full picture. These two numbers cannot both be accurate reflections of the same character's pay at the same job, and the show makes no attempt to reconcile them because reconciling them is not the point. Each one exists to serve the specific joke being told in its own episode, and the writers are not building a consistent payroll record so much as repeatedly reaching for whichever small coin will make Krabs look most outrageous in any given scene. The episode that takes this further than any other, far enough that it stops being about small wages and becomes something closer to wage law violation, played entirely for laughs, is Squid on Strike from Season 2. The premise begins straightforwardly enough for this show. Squidward, irritated by yet another payday where the result falls far short of what he believes he is owed, pushes back. He convinces SpongeBob that the two of them should go on strike, and they set up a picket line outside the Krusty Krab with handmade signs demanding better treatment. Mr. Krabs' response to the strike, rather than any negotiation or acknowledgement that his employees might have a legitimate complaint, is to hand them both a bill rather than a check. The itemized charges on SpongeBob's bill include costs for standing while on the job, breathing while on the job, and, in a touch that makes explicit exactly how Krabs thinks about the people who work for him, simply existing in the vicinity of his property. The bill for existing, in a document Krabs treats as a legally binding deduction from SpongeBob's pay, represents the purest expression in the entire series of a worldview in which an employee's physical presence is not an asset to be compensated, but a liability to be charged for. The episode Dying for Pie, covered in an earlier part of this video in a different context, contains a brief but meaningful counterpoint to all of this. Squidward mentions to Mr. Krabs, in a passing line of dialogue during that episode, that he is paid minimum wage. It is stated matter-of-factly, rather than as a complaint or a revelation, the kind of information a character delivers when establishing the basic facts of their situation, rather than making an argument about it. That detail, a single line that contradicts, or at minimum sits uncomfortably next to nearly every other piece of wage information the show has ever produced about the same job, is one of the most cited data points in fan discussions about the show's financial continuity, because it implies an entirely different version of the Krusty Krab's payroll than any of the nickel and dime figures suggest. Minimum wage, even underwater, and even in whatever decade Bikini Bottom is supposed to exist in, is a real and meaningful number. A nickel a year is not. Both of them are offered by the show as true. There are at least 2 additional payment systems the show introduces that sit outside any conventional wage structure entirely, and both of them reveal the particular creativity Mr. Krabs brings to the project of compensating people for their work without actually spending real money. The first is Wacky Bucks, introduced in the episode One Course Meal. When the question of SpongeBob's pay arises in that episode, Mr. Krabs produces a stack of what are apparently meant to resemble currency, bills printed with cartoon imagery that the show makes clear almost immediately are entirely fabricated. A private currency invented by the employer and accepted nowhere, worth nothing, backed by no institution, and useful only as a piece of evidence that Krabs has thought deliberately about how to give his employee the physical experience of receiving a paycheck without incurring the financial cost of actually paying one. The show calls them Wacky Bucks and moves on. The second invented currency appears in the episode Food Paft Truck, where SpongeBob is paid in something called Krusty Cash. The specific detail that makes Krusty Cash notable, and considerably darker than Wacky Bucks on its own terms, is the condition attached to it. Krusty Cash can apparently be spent at the Krusty Krab itself, which sounds at first like a minor convenience, until the full logic of the arrangement becomes clear. SpongeBob earns his pay in a currency that can only be used at his employer's own establishment, meaning that the money paid out for his work cycles directly back to the person paying it out, never actually leaving the system. The employee works, receives tokens, spends those tokens at the same business that issued them, and the net transfer of wealth between employer and employee across that entire cycle is precisely zero. Krabs gets SpongeBob's labor for free, and gets SpongeBob's spending back on top of it. As a piece of fictional employer behavior, it maps almost exactly to the truck system used by some industries during the 19th century, in which workers were paid in scrip redeemable only at company stores, a practice that regulators in multiple countries eventually banned precisely because of how thoroughly it trapped workers in a cycle of dependency. The show treats it as a throwaway gag. It is also, in structural terms, a fairly precise description of a real historical labor abuse. Beyond the question of what Krabs pays his employees, there is the separate and equally strange question of what he takes back. The Squid on Strike billing example represents the most extreme version of this, but the charging for things logic appears in other episodes as well, sometimes for specific items and sometimes for more abstract concepts. There are episodes where damage to the restaurant, regardless of who or what caused it, gets deducted from employee pay. There are episodes where Krabs charges SpongeBob for equipment he uses during the workday. The episode Bossy Boots, in which Pearl temporarily takes over the Krusty Krab and redecorates it as a teen hangout before getting fired, ends with SpongeBob purchasing all of the decorations Pearl added to the restaurant, including furniture, carpet, stuffed animals, and a music system, and the price for the entire lot is explicitly stated as 1 year's salary. Whatever a year's salary is in that episode, it is enough to cover a full interior renovation of a fast food restaurant, which gives at least one possible upper bound for what Krabs considers an annual wage for his best employee. Then there is the question of Jim. Jim was the fry cook at the Krusty Krab before SpongeBob, introduced in the season 5 episode The Original Fry Cook, and his departure from the restaurant is directly connected to the wage question. According to what the episode establishes, Jim was talented, dedicated, and eventually chose to quit and build a separate career for himself elsewhere, going on to become successful in ways the show implies were financially meaningful. The specific reason cited for his departure is how little Mr. Krabs paid him. Jim is, within the show's own continuity, the only employee of record who looked at the Krusty Krab's wage structure clearly enough and had enough options available to him to walk away from it entirely. In the episode, he attempts to make the same case to Squidward, encouraging him to leave before he ends up trapped there, and Squidward declines, citing his eventual career in clarinet as a fallback that justifies staying in a job he clearly despises for pay the show has never specified, but which the series' consistent treatment of Krusty Krab wages makes easy to imagine. Squidward is still there decades later, in every practical sense confirming Jim's implicit prediction. What the show actually does with all of this inconsistency, taken as a whole rather than episode by episode, is more coherent than the contradictory numbers suggest. The fluctuating wages are not a continuity error in the conventional sense, the kind that results from writers failing to check what a previous episode established. They are a different kind of inconsistency, one that serves the show's portrait of Mr. Krabs as a character whose financial relationship with his employees is governed entirely by his own shifting calculations, rather than by any fixed rate or legal obligation. The wage is whatever Krabs decides it is. Some days that is a nickel, some days it is a large bag of quarters, some days it is a stack of printed paper with cartoon faces on it that is worth nothing at all. The number changes, wages, because the number is not a number at all in any meaningful sense. It is a performance of payment, the appearance of an employer-employee wage relationship, maintained just credibly enough that SpongeBob never stops showing up in the morning, and Squidward never quite finishes the calculation that would tell him he is better off somewhere else. SpongeBob's own relationship to all of this is one of the show's more quietly remarkable things, and it feeds directly into any honest accounting of what Mr. Krabs' wealth actually represents. SpongeBob genuinely loves his job. He loves making Krabby Patties, loves the restaurant, loves his co-workers in the specific way people love things they have chosen to build their identity around, and that love makes him the ideal employee from Krabs' perspective in a way that has nothing to do with his cooking ability. A worker who loves the work itself enough to accept almost any wage in exchange for the chance to keep doing it is a worker who can be paid almost nothing, and Krabs knows this well enough that he has never been required to offer anything better. SpongeBob's contentment is not a quirk of his personality that Krabs takes advantage of by accident. It is a structural feature of the Krusty Krab's labor costs that Krabs has understood and relied on since the first season. The full accounting of Mr. Krabs' wealth has to carry this piece of information alongside every other number the video examines. Whatever the Krusty Krab earns, it earns partly because its primary labor cost across the entire run of the show has been consistently, astonishingly, sometimes surreally low. A restaurant staffed by someone who might work for a nickel a year, or for fake money, or for the simple pleasure of being allowed to stand in a kitchen and flip patties, is a restaurant with a cost structure that most real-world business owners could only dream about. Understanding what Krabs actually has starts with understanding what he has managed never to pay. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wage the show assigns to SpongeBob changes almost every time someone asks, but the pattern underneath it never does. Next comes the other side of that equation, what the restaurant is actually taking in, and the numbers on the revenue side of the Krusty Krab's books turn out to be just as difficult to pin down. Section 3. What the restaurant actually makes. There is a moment in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie that most people remember for the wrong reason. King Neptune arrives at the Krusty Krab in the middle of a packed celebration, framed against the backdrop of a restaurant that has just been declared the finest eating establishment in all of Bikini Bottom, and the crowd parts around him the way crowds part around royalty in any story where royalty still carries weight. Neptune is furious. His crown is missing, and he has already decided who took it. The moment everyone in the audience focuses on is the king, the accusation, the frozen Mr. Krabs. The moment worth examining for the purposes of this video is something smaller, something happening in the background just before Neptune enters, when Krabs glances at the menu board and quietly adds a 0 to the end of every price listed on it. A king is in the building. Kings represent an opportunity that arrives rarely enough to justify multiplying the price of everything he sells by 10, and Krabs makes that adjustment with the calm efficiency of someone who has been doing this kind of calculation his entire working life. A Krabby Patty that normally costs somewhere around $1 ends up listed at $101.99 while Neptune is in the room. Krabs does not announce the change. He does not explain it to the kitchen or warn Squidward at the register. He reaches up and adjusts the numbers, the way a person adjusts a dial, a private recalibration based on new information about what the specific market in front of him at that specific moment can bear. The joke lands immediately because it is so brazen and so completely consistent with everything the show has established about how Krabs thinks about the relationship between price and circumstance. He does not have prices. He has starting points. Getting an honest picture of what the Krusty Krab actually takes in requires sitting with that quality first. The revenue of the restaurant is not a stable figure that can be extracted from any single canonical source. Like SpongeBob's wages, the price of a Krabby Patty across the show's entire run is whatever the specific episode being written at that moment needs it to be for the scene to work. The most frequently cited official figure comes from a SpongeBob trivia book published alongside the show's licensed merchandise, which places the standard price of a Krabby Patty at $2.99, with fries and a drink included, and a reduced price of 99 cents available specifically on Wednesdays. The price that appears most often in actual episode dialogue and on the menu boards visible in the background of restaurant scenes is closer to $1 flat, occasionally slightly above or below depending on the context. In episodes where the Krusty Krab temporarily transforms into something more upscale, the price rises accordingly, with figures around $25 per patty appearing in at least one episode where the restaurant briefly operates as a full 5-star establishment. The Neptune example from the movie represents the highest ceiling the show has ever put on screen for a single Krabby Patty transaction, though it is worth noting that ceiling was applied specifically to exploit one high-value customer, rather than as a permanent adjustment to the general menu. What this price range reveals about the restaurant's revenue is less a set of numbers and more a philosophy. The Krusty Krab charges what the traffic will bear. In a normal week with normal customers, that sits somewhere in the low single digits per item. In a week where circumstances shift, where a celebrity arrives, where a rival temporarily closes down, where a food trend sweeps through Bikini Bottom, or where royalty walks through the front door, the price moves upward as far as Krabs believes the room will tolerate, without people turning around and leaving. That flexibility is not incidental to how the restaurant makes money. It is central to it. The foot traffic question matters as much as the price question when building any serious estimate of daily revenue, and the show provides considerably more consistent information on this front than it does on pricing. The Krusty Krab is described throughout the series, and treated in essentially every episode, as the dominant food establishment in Bikini Bottom by a margin that leaves almost no meaningful competition standing. The Chum Bucket, located directly across the street and owned by Plankton, fails to attract customers in nearly every episode where it appears. A running joke built around the complete unpalatability of Plankton's cooking and the absolute loyalty Bikini Bottom's population has developed toward Krabby Patties specifically. That loyalty is not soft or conditional. In the film, a disruption in the Krabby Patty supply produces full-scale social breakdown within the town, and Krabs delivers a line treating the patty not as a food product but as the specific mechanism holding civilization together, a claim the film's subsequent chaos supports more than undermines. A community that size, entirely dependent on one food source, and with no viable alternative available within the established geography of the show, represents a customer base that generates consistent and significant daily revenue for any restaurant smart enough to hold the position the Krusty Krab holds. The specific operating hours the show has recorded across different episodes paint the picture of a business running close to full capacity across most of the week. Sources tracking the restaurant's canonical schedule place it open from the early morning through at least 9 at night on most weekdays, with extended hours on Friday and Saturday, and a notably later closing time on Tuesdays. Following the failure of Plankton's attempt to undercut the Krusty Krab by running the Chum Bucket on a near round-the-clock schedule, the show established that the Krusty Krab switched to a 23-hour daily operating window, a detail that raises the revenue ceiling considerably compared to the standard daytime hours that seem to apply in the earlier seasons. The episode Clams, from Season 3, gives the most direct canonical statement about cumulative revenue in the show's entire history, and it does so almost by accident, burying the most financially significant piece of information in what appears to be a setup for a Jaws parody. The episode begins at a completely ordinary moment inside the restaurant. A customer named Scooter orders coral bits for $1. Squidward rings up the sale with his usual level of enthusiasm, which is none. Then the building erupts. Alarms sound. Balloons fall. Mr. Krabs bursts from his office and begins dancing with the $1 bill in a way that leaves SpongeBob and Squidward genuinely confused about what is happening. The explanation arrives quickly. That specific dollar, from that specific unremarkable customer, at that specific unremarkable moment, is Mr. Krabs' $1,000,000th earned through the Krusty Krab. The episode tells the audience that reaching $1 million is every Krab's life goal, a milestone significant enough that Krabs immediately closes the restaurant, pushes every customer out the door, and announces that he is taking his crew on a celebratory trip. $1 million, reached at some point during or before the show's third season, is the first hard cumulative number the series offers about the restaurant's total earnings across its operating history. Fan analysts working backward from that figure have noted that reaching $1 million in cumulative sales at a restaurant selling items in the $1 to $3 range, operating with effectively zero competition in its market, and running close to full hours 6 days a week, is not only achievable but potentially conservative depending on how much daily traffic the Krusty Krab handles. A restaurant in that structural position, serving a captive population with no reliable dining alternative, would reach $1 million in cumulative sales within a few years under almost any realistic daily volume assumption. The fact that the $1 million milestone is treated as a major career achievement rather than a routine operational landmark might suggest the restaurant's daily volume is lower than its apparent monopoly position implies, or might simply reflect the show using the figure for its comedic and dramatic weight rather than as a precise financial record. The episode immediately demonstrates which of those is more likely to be true by having Krabs lose the $1,000,000th to a giant clam within minutes of earning it, sending the rest of the runtime into an obsessive recovery mission that requires Krabs to trade pieces of his own body to a sea creature in exchange for getting the bill back. The $1 million figure exists in that episode to give Krabs something worth losing catastrophically, not to anchor the franchise's financial continuity ingenuity to a specific earnings record. With that said, the structural facts the show does establish about the Krusty Krab's revenue model are more consistent than the specific numbers, and those structural facts paint a picture of a business with genuinely strong fundamentals operating underneath all the chaos. The restaurant has an effectively captive customer base, with no reliable alternative available anywhere nearby. Its signature product generates a level of demand the show treats as closer to compulsion than ordinary food preference, with multiple episodes built around the premise that Krabby Patties produce a desire in consumers that regular food simply does not. The recipe producing that effect is held by one person, protected obsessively across the entire run of the series, meaning no competitor can replicate the product, and the Krusty Krab's advantage cannot be eroded by imitation, no matter how many times Plankton tries. Labor costs sit at levels that range from very low to effectively zero. Fixed costs appear minimal, since the building was acquired cheaply decades earlier, and no episode ever suggests ongoing rent, mortgage payments, or significant maintenance obligations that would eat into profit margins. The episode Selling Out is worth sitting with separately because it introduces the one moment in the series where the Krusty Krab's value as a business asset gets tested against an actual external buyer's offer. Howard Blandy, the corporate operator who approaches Krabs with a purchase proposal in that episode, is willing to pay what the show describes as a large sum of money for the restaurant, large enough that Krabs accepts the offer and retires. The precise figure is never stated on screen, which is typical of how the show handles large monetary amounts, when specificity would undermine the joke being built around the transaction. But the fact that the offer was substantial enough to fund a comfortable retirement for a character defined by financial anxiety provides at least one meaningful external data point. An experienced corporate buyer with presumably some knowledge of what the Krusty Krab's revenue actually looks like from the outside believed the restaurant was worth a significant acquisition price. Blandy turned out to be wrong about his ability to replicate what made the restaurant valuable, which is the episode's central joke and its most satisfying outcome, but his willingness to pay seriously for the business suggests the Krusty Krab carries real value on paper, even to people approaching it purely as a financial asset rather than as the anchor of their entire identity. The price gouging that surfaces throughout the show's run represents a separate revenue stream on top of ordinary sales, and it is worth documenting because it reveals another dimension of how Krabs thinks about the difference between his list price and the amount any given customer might actually pay. In the episode Truth or Square, which marks the Krusty Krab's 117th anniversary, Krabs responds to the occasion by adding an extra zero to the end of every price on the menu, his logic being that a celebration provides sufficient cover to charge 10 times the normal rate for everything the kitchen produces. This is the same logic he applies when Neptune visits in the movie, scaled down slightly for an anniversary rather than a royal appearance, but rooted in the same fundamental principle that price is a variable to be adjusted upward whenever circumstances provide an excuse. The show treats this behavior as a character joke rather than as a business strategy, but it describes something real about how the Krusty Krab actually operates. Whatever the posted price says on any given day, the price Krabs actually charges is the highest number he believes the specific customer in front of him at that specific moment will pay without walking out. What the Krusty Krab actually earns in any given day, month, or year is a number the show has deliberately kept imprecise, because precision would require committing to a consistent economic logic the series has never been interested in maintaining across its full run. What the structural picture assembled from over 2 decades of episodes does suggest is a business with near monopoly positioning in its market, a proprietary product protected from imitation by a secret the owner has spent his entire adult life defending, labor costs kept at the absolute minimum through a combination of psychological exploitation and invented currency, and daily revenue sufficient to have crossed $1 million in cumulative sales by the show's 3rd season and kept building steadily from there. The restaurant generates real and significant money. How much of that money currently sits in whatever form Mr. Krabs keeps it is what the official calculation attempted to determine, and the number that calculation produced is where this video turns next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The restaurant generates real money, and the structural case for how much is stronger than the show's own comedy usually lets on. Next comes the one time someone with real financial expertise actually ran the numbers, and the figure they landed on surprised almost everyone who saw it. Section 4, the official number. At some point in the last decade, someone at the organization that runs the SpongeBob SquarePants YouTube channel decided that the question of Mr. Krabs' actual net worth deserved a real answer rather than a cartoon one. Not a figure pulled from an episode, not a joke number dropped into dialogue for a quick laugh, but a genuine attempt to apply real-world financial financial methodology to everything the show had established about the restaurant, the owner, the assets, and the revenue, and produce a number that could be defended with the same tools an actual financial advisor would use to assess an actual business. The result of that exercise was published with the show's own branding attached to it, and the number it landed on was $5,249,351. $5,249,351 for a character whose entire identity is built around loving money more than anything else in the world, whose every action across 25 years of television has been shaped by the pursuit of more of it. That figure lands with a specific kind of deflating quality. It is not a small number in the context of an ordinary person's finances. $5 million is more than most people in the real world will earn across an entire working lifetime, and by any reasonable standard of individual wealth, it places its holder comfortably in the category of people who will never have to worry about paying rent or buying groceries or pulling clothes from a dumpster. But it is also, unmistakably, not the kind of number that explains the scale of obsession the show has spent over 2 decades building around this character. A person with $5 million does not sell an employee's soul to cover a medical bill. A person with $5 million does not charge their workers for breathing. A person with $5 million does not stalk a child across an entire episode hunting for a penny they think might be buried in the yard. The gap between what the official number says and what the show's behavior suggests is the most interesting thing about the calculation, and understanding it requires looking at both what the assessment included and what it may have missed or deliberately excluded. The methodology behind the $5 million figure, as best as can be reconstructed from what was shared publicly alongside the number, involves treating the Krusty Krab as the primary asset and working outward from there. A real financial advisor, working with what the show's own episodes establish about the restaurant's revenue, operating costs, staff size, and market position, would approach it the same way they would approach valuing any small, owner-operated food service business. The standard approach for a restaurant of that type involves looking at annual revenue, calculating net profit after operating expenses, and applying a multiple to that profit figure to arrive at an enterprise value for the business itself. For a small, well-established restaurant with a dominant local market position and no meaningful competition, those multiples are typically in the range of 2 to 4 times annual profit, sometimes higher if the business has unique characteristics that create barriers to competition. The Krusty Krab has several characteristics that would push its valuation toward the higher end of any comparable range. Its product is protected by a trade secret that Plankton's decades of attempts have failed to crack, meaning its competitive advantage cannot be replicated by a new entrant copying the menu. Its brand recognition within Bikini Bottom appears absolute, to the degree that the film treats a disruption in Krabby Patty supply as a civilizational crisis rather than a minor inconvenience. Its labor costs, as established across multiple sections of this video, are maintained at levels that create a cost structure most restaurant operators could not achieve without cutting quality in ways that would damage their customer base. All of those factors would support a higher valuation multiplier than a typical small restaurant would receive. The property question matters separately. The Krusty Krab building is not rented or leased in any episode that addresses the question. Mr. Krabs owns it outright, having acquired it decades earlier when it was a bankrupt retirement home worth very little. Whatever it was worth when he bought it, it has since become the most visited food establishment in Bikini Bottom, located on what is clearly a high-traffic piece of ocean floor real estate given the consistent crowd scenes that play out around it across the show's run. The anchor that serves as his private residence is similarly owned outright, a property detail the show establishes through the ease with which Krabs moves in and out of it, and makes modifications without any suggestion of a landlord or mortgage holder being involved. Where the official calculation runs into its most significant limitation is in the question of how Mr. Krabs actually holds his money when it is not actively being used for something. The show offers consistent visual evidence across dozens of episodes that a meaningful portion of his wealth is held as literal physical cash, rather than in any form of investment, savings account, or financial instrument that would generate returns over time or be captured cleanly in a net worth calculation. The money bath is one of the most recurring visual gags in the series, a moment where Krabs is shown immersed in a pile of loose bills and coins inside his office, handling the physical currency the way a person handles something precious and irreplaceable. The vault where he stores the Krabby Patty formula, lined with stacked money in multiple episodes, suggests a hoarding behavior toward cash that would be deeply inefficient from any standard investment perspective, but entirely consistent with the psychology of a character whose formative experience with money was holding a single dollar as a child and loving it like a companion. A financial advisor calculating net worth for a standard client would include cash holdings in the total, but access accessing an accurate figure for a character who keeps an unspecified amount of physical currency in a private safe rather than a bank account introduces obvious measurement problems. If the official calculation relied primarily on the business valuation and the visible, documentable assets, while leaving aside a cash reserve that the show implies is substantial but never quantifies precisely, the resulting figure could be significantly lower than the character's actual total holdings. Fan analysts who have tried to build more comprehensive estimates from the available episode evidence have landed on numbers that dwarf the official figure by orders of magnitude. The most rigorous fan analysis available, built on a framework of comparative business valuation and drawing on everything the episodes establish about the Krusty Krab's market position, staff structure, and product advantage, arrives at a range of $200 million to $2 billion, with the most defensible single-point estimate placed somewhere between $600 million and $800 million. The reasoning behind that range applies the same valuation logic a professional would use for a highly successful owner-operated business with a defensible competitive moat, adjusting for the specific characteristics the show has established about both the restaurant and its market. A burger franchise with true local monopoly power, a proprietary product that cannot be replicated, and operating costs maintained at the absolute minimum across decades of continuous operation is not a $5 million business by any standard of comparable valuation, even before accounting for cash reserves or real estate. The distance between $5 million and $600 million is not a small discrepancy. It is a difference that suggests either the official calculation used extremely conservative assumptions about the restaurant's revenue and profit margins, or it reflects a deliberate choice to anchor the number in something modest enough to remain consistent with the show's comedic framing of Krabs as a character defined by penny pinching, rather than as a genuinely wealthy person by any objective measure. A character worth $600 million, behaving the way Mr. Krabs behaves, would require a different kind of explanation than a character worth $5 million, behaving the same way. The $5 million figure keeps the behavior in a zone where it can still be read as the anxious overcorrection of someone who has been poor and is terrified of returning to poverty. The $600 million figure starts to require a psychological explanation that goes somewhere darker and less comedic. There is an episode that functions, in the context of this discussion, as the show's own most direct attempt to put a ceiling on Krabs' visible liquid wealth in a single scene. In Squeaky Boots, a Season 1 episode, Mr. Krabs produces SpongeBob's paycheck in the form of a full envelope of cash, which the episode presents as a genuine payment rather than one of the later season's fake currency or impossible deductions. The envelope implies a payroll process that uses real money at a real, if unspecified, amount. In Skill Crane, a Season 3 episode, Krabs appears on payday carrying a large bag of quarters, again presented as genuine payment, the quarters being used specifically to feed the Skill Crane machine Krabs has installed in the restaurant to generate additional revenue from his own employees. These early season payment scenes, both of which treat payroll as a real cost involving real currency, sit awkwardly against the nickel-a-year figure and the wacky bucks from later seasons. But they also suggest that at the show's starting point, the wage question was handled more conventionally, with actual money changing hands at amounts that were low but not cartoonishly impossible. There are also the episode-level cash amounts that surface occasionally as reference points for what individual transactions look like in Bikini Bottom's economy. In One Krab's Trash, SpongeBob is able to produce $5.68 to purchase the soda hat that drives that episode's plot, which establishes a minimum liquid cash amount for a character whose annual wages have elsewhere been described as less than a dime. In the movie, Krabs raises the price of a single Krabby Patty to over $100 and treats this as a reasonable charge rather than an obviously extortionate one, which implies either that the Bikini Bottom economy runs at a scale where individual food items can plausibly cost $100 without causing universal outrage, or that King Neptune's presence was understood by everyone in the room to warrant a completely different pricing framework than normal operations. What all of these figures together suggest is that the Krusty Krab exists in an economic environment that the show has deliberately never made internally consistent, because consistency would require choosing one set of implications and living with all of them, and any set of implications rigorous enough to produce a reliable net worth figure would also constrain the kind of jokes the show has always been more interested in than financial accuracy. The official $5 million figure represents the most honest attempt anyone connected to the franchise has made to answer the question using real methodology, and it is worth taking seriously as a floor rather than dismissing it as obviously wrong. But the structural analysis of the business, built from what the episodes actually establish about its market position and operating economics, produces numbers that suggest the floor may be considerably considerably higher than the official answer implies. What both sets of numbers share is an inability to account for the thing that may ultimately matter most to any honest assessment of Mr. Krabs' wealth: the money he keeps in the safe, the money in the room he bathes in, the cash that has been accumulating in whatever physical form he keeps it since the day he earned his first dollar from a customer at a bankrupt retirement home he renamed with a painted letter. That money does not appear on any balance sheet. It does not generate returns or sit in a fund or appreciate in any way that a financial advisor could capture in a net worth calculation. It simply exists, in the dark, behind a locked door, in the specific form that a child who once loved a single-dollar bill more than almost anything would choose to keep his savings. Close enough to touch, impossible to lose, proof against every version of the poverty that shaped him before he had any money at all. The official number is $5,249,351. The real number is larger than that, possibly much larger, and neither of them is the point. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The official number exists, and it almost certainly understates the real total. What sits even further outside any calculation is the value of the thing Krabs protects more obsessively than the money itself, the secret that makes the money possible in the first place. Section 5. The secret formula and what it is actually worth. There is a jar sitting in a safe inside the Krusty Krab, and almost nothing about it makes immediate sense. The jar is small, the safe is large. The Krab who owns both of them has spent the entire run of a 25-year television series treating the contents of that jar as the single most important object in his possession, more important than his house, more important than his restaurant building, more important by a significant margin than the wages of the 2 employees who show up every morning to make the thing inside the jar commercially viable. Every villain who has ever come within range of Bikini Bottom has, at some point, turned their attention toward that jar. Every scheme Plankton has run across hundreds of episodes, across multiple theatrical films, across spin-off series and video games and a Broadway musical, has been pointed at the same destination: getting the formula, taking what is in the jar, and across all of that, through every failed attempt and reset and temporary victory and subsequent reversal, the formula has remained where it started, in the safe, behind the locked door, in the building that used to be a retirement home. The Krabby Patty secret formula is the most protected asset in the SpongeBob universe, and it is worth thinking carefully about why, because the answer to that question is also the answer to why the Krusty Krab is worth significantly more than any straightforward accounting of its physical assets and annual revenue would suggest. A restaurant that owns a secret is not just a restaurant. It is a restaurant plus the commercial value of the secret itself, and in the Krusty Krab's case, that secret is not a minor proprietary advantage or a small operational edge over the competition. It is the entire reason the restaurant exists, the specific thing that converts a retired retirement home with 2 unhappy employees into the most visited food establishment in Bikini Bottom. Without the formula, the Krusty Krab is a building. With it, the building becomes something closer to a monopoly. The history of the formula is one of the show's most deliberately tangled continuity puzzles, offered in different versions across different episodes, without any single authoritative account that reconciles all of them. The version most commonly cited as the primary origin comes from the Season 5 episode Friend or Foe, which traces the earliest attempt at a burger business by the young Krabs and Plankton partnership. Their first attempt at a recipe poisoned Old Man Jenkins. The fight that followed that failure ended with both of them pulling at a written formula from opposite ends, tearing it in two. Plankton walked away with the bottom half, which contained one ingredient, a pinch of chum. Krabs kept the rest, and a subsequent accident involving a collapsed shelf sent various other ingredients tumbling into the patty batter in a combination that turned out to produce something consumers actually wanted to eat. That accidental combination became the Krabby Patty formula. The chum became the foundation of everything Plankton has served at the Chum Bucket since, which is its own quiet explanation for why the Chum Bucket's food has never attracted customers without some form of coercion being involved. A separate account, offered through the episode Dunces and Dragons, pushes the formula's origins back considerably further, into a medieval version of Bikini Bottom, where an ancestor named King Krabs served a version of the Krabby Patty during a period the episode sets in something resembling the Middle Ages. That version frames the recipe as a family inheritance rather than an accidental discovery, handed down through the Krabs bloodline across centuries before landing with Eugene. A third layer of the formula's history comes from the general framing the show uses for the secret ingredient question specifically, the element within the larger recipe that makes the patty uniquely compelling to consumers. Series creator Steven Hillenburg maintained throughout his time on the show that the secret ingredient would never be revealed, and a 2017 statement from writer and producer Vincent Waller confirmed that there is no meat in the Krabby Patty, meaning the patty does not contain fish, which would be consistent with the show's broader rule that fish are not depicted as food in Bikini Bottom outside the chum bucket. Following Hillenburg's death in 2018, Waller added that Hillenburg was the only person who ever knew the full formula, a statement that functions, if taken seriously, as a confirmation that the most valuable trade secret in Bikini Bottom may be genuinely irretrievable at this point, even within the fictional world the show has built. That last detail carries real weight when thinking about the formula as an asset. A trade secret whose full contents are known to exactly one person, and that person is no longer available to share it, is a trade secret in a state of profound vulnerability, regardless of how carefully the jar is guarded. The show does not appear to have engaged with this implication seriously, and SpongeBob continues to produce Krabby Patties in every episode without any suggestion that the cooking knowledge required to execute the formula has been lost or compromised. The implication the show seems to operate on is that SpongeBob carries the practical knowledge needed to make the patty, regardless of what the formula written on the paper inside the jar actually says. Which raises a separate question about whether the jar is protecting information or whether the jar is itself a kind of theatrical prop. A physical object whose existence as a guarded secret creates the impression of a dangerous vulnerability that Plankton can spend his life trying to exploit, while the real formula lives in the hands of a sponge who shows up every morning without needing to consult it. Setting the internal contradictions of the formula's history aside, what matters for any accounting of Mr. Krabs' wealth is the commercial value attached to the formula as an asset in the real-world sense of the term. Trade secrets have legal protection and financial value in actual business law, and the framework used to assess that value in genuine commercial contexts maps onto the Krusty Krab situation in ways that suggest the formula is worth considerably more than the restaurant's physical assets or its annual revenue alone. The standard approach to valuing a trade secret in a real commercial setting involves assessing what the secret makes possible that would not otherwise be possible without it. In the Krusty Krab's case, the formula is what makes the Krabby Patty the specific product it is, and the Krabby Patty is the only reason customers choose the Krusty Krab over any alternative. Plankton's decades of failed attempts to replicate the patty without the formula, producing food so bad that it consistently drives away anyone who tries it, represent the clearest possible demonstration of what the formula is worth in negative terms. The difference between what the Krusty Krab earns and what the chum bucket earns, measured across the full run of the show, is approximately the difference between a thriving business and one that has never successfully served a paying customer through ordinary means. That gap, the distance between those two outcomes, is the value the formula creates by existing and by remaining protected. A real-world analogy that fans and analysts have applied to this specific situation is the Coca-Cola formula, the secret recipe for Coca-Cola syrup that the company has protected since 1886 and whose protection is treated internally as a core corporate priority rather than an incidental security concern. The Coca-Cola company has historically stored the written formula in a bank vault and maintained a policy of never patenting the recipe, specifically because patents expire and trade secrets do not, a strategic choice that has kept the specific formulation proprietary for close to 140 years. Mr. Krabs' approach to his own formula, keeping it in a physical safe rather than registering it as intellectual property that could be legally protected but also eventually expire, maps almost exactly onto the Coca-Cola strategy, whether intentionally or not. The parallel breaks down at several points, including the fact that Coca-Cola's formula is known to multiple people within a large corporation, rather than being the exclusive knowledge of one man and one sponge, but the basic strategic logic is the same. A secret kept physically rather than legally protected by a filing that puts it in the public domain after a fixed term. What a formula like this would actually be worth, in the context of a business the size and reach of the Krusty Krab, depends heavily on how the restaurant's market is defined. In the narrow definition, the Krusty Krab serves Bikini Bottom and the surrounding area, which puts a ceiling on the total addressable market. In the broader definition, implied by various episodes that show the Krabby Patty's reputation extending well beyond Bikini Bottom's immediate geography, the formula protects a product whose potential market is considerably larger. The film's premise depends on the Krabby Patty being significant enough that its absence produces a Bikini Bottom-wide crisis, which implies the product's market reach is coextensive with at least the full population of the underwater city the show is built around. The Krusty Krab 2, opened in the film right next to the original location, demonstrates that the formula can support at least a second location without the product losing its appeal, which is a meaningful indicator of scalability. Plankton's own valuation of the formula, expressed through the resources he has devoted to obtaining it across the entire run of the show, provides another data point worth considering. Plankton is not a character who wastes effort on things he does not believe will pay off. He is described as a scientific genius, is shown to have built sophisticated technology with apparently limited resources, and has maintained a single strategic focus across decades without any meaningful deviation from his central goal. A rational actor spending that level of sustained effort on a single objective is, by definition, expressing a belief that the objective is worth the cost of the effort. Whatever Plankton believes the formula would do for the Chum Bucket's competitive position if he obtained it, his behavior across the entire series suggests he considers the value enormous enough to justify an indefinite commitment of his time, intelligence, and resources to acquiring it. The show's own writers have addressed the question of whether the secret ingredient actually exists in a way that adds an additional layer of complexity to the formula's valuation. The suggestion that there may be no secret ingredient at all, that the formula's power could be entirely a function of the skill and care SpongeBob brings to the cooking, rather than anything proprietary in the recipe itself, appears in various pieces of fan analysis, and was referenced by at least one entertainment writer as a plausible reading of what the show leaves ambiguous. If the formula is partly or entirely theatrical, a document that protects a secret that is less about specific ingredients and more about the specific person executing the recipe, then its value as a transferable asset is lower than it appears, because taking the formula without also taking SpongeBob would not produce the same product. Plankton's consistent failure across every attempt that involves stealing the formula without also securing SpongeBob's cooperation is at least circumstantially consistent with this reading. What all of this means for any accounting of what Mr. Krabs actually has is that the formula needs to be treated as a separate line item from the restaurant's physical value and its annual revenue, and that the number assigned to it involves more uncertainty than almost any other component of the calculation. The most conservative reading values it at whatever premium the Krusty Krab earns over what a comparable restaurant without a proprietary product would earn, compounded across the years the secret has been held. A more aggressive reading assigns it the full enterprise value of the restaurant, on the grounds that without the formula, the enterprise has no value beyond its real estate. The most honest reading acknowledges that the formula's value is real and significant, that it is the foundation on which everything else the Krusty Krab earns rests, and that any net worth figure for Mr. Krabs that does not include a serious estimate of the formula's commercial value is an undercount regardless of what other assets it includes. A jar in a safe. A recipe that may have existed for 8 centuries, or may have been created by accident during a childhood argument. A secret whose full contents may have died with the man who created the show itself. And a business that has run on top of it, profitably, and without meaningful competition, for longer than most real-world restaurants survive their first 3 years. Whatever Mr. Krabs is worth, the formula is a meaningful piece of that total, possibly the largest single piece of it, and it is one he has never come close to losing, despite every effort that has been made to take it from him. The safe stays locked, the jar stays in the safe, the patties keep selling, and the number keeps growing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The formula is the foundation of everything the Krusty Krab earns, and it has stayed protected through every attempt to take it. But protecting a recipe is a very different thing from protecting a soul, and the next section covers the moment Mr. Krabs put a price on one and came up with a number that said more about him than any balance sheet ever could. Section 6, 62 cents. Before the number itself arrived, the episode had to establish something about the man being asked to produce it. Born Again Krabs aired on October 4th, 2003, as part of the show's 3rd season, and it opens not with a ghost ship or a supernatural bargain, but with something considerably more ordinary and considerably more revealing. A regular morning at the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob at the grill, customers at the tables, and underneath the grill, tucked into the corner, where grease and time and general neglect conspire to hide things indefinitely, a Krabby Patty that has been sitting there long enough that its color and texture have moved into territory the show leaves somewhat to the imagination, but makes unmistakably clear, is well past any reasonable definition of edible. Mr. Krabs finds the patty. He examines it. He recognizes it for exactly what it is. A piece of food so far gone that serving it to a customer would be, at minimum, a serious health violation, and at maximum something considerably worse. The episode gives him a clear moment of decision. The patty is worthless. Throwing it away costs nothing except the loss of something that was already worth nothing. Keeping it costs the health of whoever eats it. Krabs, performing the mental arithmetic that governs almost every choice he makes, arrives at his answer. He cannot bring himself to throw away something he could theoretically sell. He decides to serve the patty to the next customer, who comes through the door and hope for the best. The best does not happen. The customer, a background fish who does not survive the transaction in any meaningful sense, takes takes one bite, and the consequences are immediate enough that SpongeBob notices from the kitchen window. Mr. Krabs, watching this unfold and recognizing the liability implications of what he has just set in motion, intervenes in the way he most frequently intervenes in situations of his own creation. He blames SpongeBob. He insists the contaminated patty was SpongeBob's fault, a reflexive deflection that the episode does not dignify with a counter-argument because SpongeBob, being SpongeBob, does not make one. The episode moves on, and then, in the quiet moment after the customer has been dealt with and the restaurant has returned to something resembling normal, Mr. Krabs does something that the show uses as the episode's inciting disaster. He eats the patty himself. The reasoning behind this decision is not stated aloud, but does not need to be. Krabs ate the contaminated patty because he could not throw it away. Having already established that the patty existed and had some theoretical value, having already made the decision to serve it rather than discard it, the logical endpoint of that thinking, in a man who cannot release anything with potential monetary value, is to consume it personally, rather than let it go to waste entirely. He eats the patty. He ends up in the hospital. The show stages this as the natural consequence of a very specific kind of cheapness, the kind where the calculation of value overrides every other input, including the physical signals his own body is generating about what he is putting into it. The hospital scene that follows is where the episode shifts into something slightly more unusual for the show's third season register. Mr. Krabs is described as being near death, or at minimum, near enough that the hospital staff treats the situation with real gravity, rather than the casual slapstick the show typically applies to physical injury. Lying in a hospital bed with an uncertain immediate future, Krabs appears to undergo something the episode treats as a genuine moment of reflection, a crack in the armor of pure financial calculation, wide enough for something more human to come through. He tells SpongeBob and Squidward from the bed that he is going to change. He is going to become generous. He is going to stop valuing money above everything else and start treating the people around him the way they deserve to be treated. The episode stages this announcement with enough sincerity that SpongeBob believes it completely, which is consistent with SpongeBob's character, but also, for viewers who know the show well, a source of a particular kind of dread about where the episode is going next. Krabs is discharged from the hospital. He is presented with a bill. He pays it without complaint, which for this character at this moment functions as its own form of evidence that something genuinely unusual has happened to him. He returns to the Krusty Krab, and for a stretch of the episode that is long enough to feel real, he acts like a different person. He gives customers free refills. He allows a child to keep a toy that technically belongs to the restaurant rather than extracting the price of it from the child's parents. He runs promotions. He smiles at people without calculating what their visit is worth to him. SpongeBob watches all of this with the uncomplicated joy of someone who has always wanted to see his employer be the version of himself that this episode is briefly allowing him to be. The Flying Dutchman's arrival changes the temperature of the episode immediately and completely. The Dutchman, who functions across the show's run as the closest thing Bikini Bottom has to a figure of actual supernatural authority over questions of death and what follows it, arrives at the Krusty Krab with a specific grievance and a specific list. Krabs, according to the Dutchman, was scheduled to be collected during his hospital visit and brought to Davy Jones' locker, the show's version of whatever waits on the other side of a sea creature's last moment. The charge that justifies this destination is not violence or malice or any of the more dramatic sins the show has occasionally attributed to Krabs. The charge is cheapness. The Dutchman has concluded, based on an apparently thorough review of Krabs' history, that a life built around the degree of financial cruelty Krabs has practiced warrants a permanent assignment to the place the show reserves for those who have made the wrong choices consistently enough that the ledger cannot be balanced any other way. SpongeBob intervenes. This is the part of the episode that matters most for the purposes of this section, the part where the specific number arrives. SpongeBob, standing between his employer and a supernatural figure with the authority to carry out a permanent sentence, argues the case for Mr. Krabs' fundamental goodness with the kind of total, undefended sincerity that only SpongeBob can manage. He tells the Flying Dutchman that Krabs is kind, that he is generous, that he is a good person underneath the behavior that the Dutchman has reviewed and found wanting. The Dutchman, unimpressed, responds to this argument by proposing a test. He tells SpongeBob that Krabs would sell SpongeBob's own soul for a couple of dollars if given the opportunity. SpongeBob, completely certain this is wrong, makes the mistake that drives the rest of the scene. He bets his own soul on it. If the Dutchman can get Krabs to sell SpongeBob's soul for money, SpongeBob will hand his soul over voluntarily. If the Dutchman cannot, Krabs goes free. The Dutchman turns to Krabs. He makes an offer. He will purchase SpongeBob's soul from his employer, the person theoretically responsible for his welfare and in whose restaurant he has spent his entire adult working life, for cash. The offer is made, the amount is not specified in advance. Krabs is simply asked whether he is willing to sell. He says yes. The Dutchman counts out the payment. The amount he pays for the soul of SpongeBob SquarePants, the most loyal employee in the history of the Krusty Krab, the fry cook whose cooking ability is the foundation of every dollar the restaurant has ever earned, the character who has spent every working morning of his adult life showing up early and staying late and meaning it when he says he loves the job, is 62 cents. 62 cents. The room goes quiet, in the specific way cartoon rooms go quiet when a joke has landed somewhere more uncomfortable than expected. Squidward, who has spent most of the series establishing himself as the character least likely to defend SpongeBob against anything, looks at Mr. Krabs and delivers what may be the most emotionally direct line he has given in the entire third season. He says he cannot believe he is saying this, but asks how Krabs could trade SpongeBob for 62 cents. The response Krabs gives to that question is the other half of what makes this scene remarkable. He does not defend the decision. He does not claim he was coerced or confused or still recovering from the hospital patty. He asks, with genuine curiosity, whether Squidward thinks he could have gotten more. The question is played as a joke, and it lands as one, but it is also a completely accurate and unguarded statement of how Krabs processed the transaction in real time. He was not troubled by the fact of the sale. He was not weighing SpongeBob's welfare against the money being offered. He was running a standard evaluation, asking himself whether the amount being offered reflected the fair market value of the thing being sold, and the answer he arrived at was that 62 cents might have been on the low side of a defensible price. The moral dimension of the transaction did not register as a variable in that calculation at all. Squidward's follow-up lands harder than almost anything else in the episode. He tells Krabs that SpongeBob stuck up for him, that SpongeBob put his own soul on the line to protect his employer from a supernatural consequence that Krabs had earned through his own behavior, and Krabs sold him out for less than the price of a bus ride. Squidward tells Krabs he should be ashamed of himself. The episode gives Krabs a moment of genuine remorse here, a beat where the character actually registers what he has done and responds to it with something other than financial rationalization. He looks uncomfortable. He looks, briefly and unusually, like a person who has done something he wishes he could undo. The resolution of the scene comes from an unexpected direction. The Flying Dutchman takes SpongeBob away, beginning the process of collecting on the bargain Krabs has just made. But he returns SpongeBob almost immediately, and the reason he gives for returning him is the same reason SpongeBob has survived countless situations across the show's run that should logically have ended worse for him. SpongeBob is simply too much, too relentlessly cheerful, too earnestly helpful, too completely himself, in a way that makes spending any sustained amount of time around him an overwhelming experience for anyone not already accustomed to it. The Flying Dutchman, an immortal supernatural figure with centuries of experience collecting souls, cannot manage more than a few minutes of SpongeBob's company before deciding that the transaction was not worth completing. He gives SpongeBob back. He releases Krabs from whatever obligation was attached to the original collection notice, and the episode ends with Krabs' brief period of generosity already fading. The man who promised to change, reverting to the man he actually is, with a speed that suggests the promise was always more about the fear of Davy Jones' locker than about any genuine shift in how he understood himself. The 62 cents figure has a specific weight inside the show's financial history that goes beyond its function as a punchline. In the context of the wage discussion from earlier in this video, where SpongeBob's annual salary is placed at various points between a nickel and a dime, 62 cents represents somewhere between 6 and 12 times his yearly earnings. Put another way, the price Mr. Krabs accepted for SpongeBob's soul is roughly what SpongeBob would earn across the better part of a decade of full-time employment at the Krusty Krab under the show's most generous wage figures. The transaction does not just reveal that Krabs was willing to sell SpongeBob. It reveals that the price he accepted maps almost exactly onto the monetary value his behavior had already assigned to the person throughout the employment relationship. 62 cents is not an insultingly low number, chosen for dramatic effect in that scene. It is internally consistent with everything the Krusty Krab has already established about what SpongeBob's time and loyalty are worth in financial terms. The episode's legacy within the fandom reflects the specific discomfort the scene generates even decades after its original broadcast. Fan discussions of born-again Krabs consistently return to the 62 cents moment as a dividing line within the show's portrait of Krabs as a character. The specific moment where the line between cheapness as comedy and cheapness as genuine moral failure becomes difficult to maintain. Viewers who find Krabs' behavior in later seasons harder to enjoy as pure comedy often cite this episode as the point where something shifted, where the show demonstrated that his greed had an actual floor, and the floor was this: selling his most loyal loyal employee to a ghost for less than the price of a cup of coffee. What keeps the episode from landing as pure darkness is the same thing that keeps almost everything in the show's best seasons from landing that way. The structure does not let anyone, including Krabs, stay in the worst version of themselves for long enough to make the audience feel that version is the only version. The remorse is real, even if it does not last. The return of SpongeBob is absurd enough to deflate the tension before it becomes genuinely upsetting, and Squidward calling Krabs out, a choice the episode frames as something unusual enough to require the line about not being able to believe he is saying it, functions as an acknowledgement from inside the show's own moral universe that what happened was wrong, stated plainly rather than softened or dressed in irony. 62 cents. The specific amount matters less than what the willingness to name any amount at all reveals. A man who could be shown a figure and say yes, a man for whom the transaction was evaluable, is a man for whom the thing being transacted was always, on some level, a commodity. Not because he does not care about SpongeBob, because in the show's better moments he clearly does, but because the habit of converting everything into a financial calculation is deep enough and old enough that it operates independently of caring, running its assessment and arriving at its number before the part of him that might object has had time to weigh in. 62 cents. The price the richest crab in Bikini Bottom put on the soul of the person who made him rich. Filed, evaluated, and accepted without the math ever once stopping to ask whether the math should be run at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 62 cents is the number the show put on SpongeBob's soul, and it is internally consistent with everything else the Krusty Krab has ever paid him. Next comes the other side of the ledger, the things Mr. Krabs actually chooses to spend money on, and the list turns out to be shorter and stranger than most people would expect. Section 7. What he actually spends it on. A man who charges his employees for breathing, who pays his fry cook in fictional currency, who once ate a contaminated patty rather than throw away something he could theoretically sell, does not spend money freely. That much is established across the entire run of the show, without any real ambiguity. The more interesting question, the one that takes longer to answer and says more about the character once the answer arrives, is not whether Mr. Krabs spends money, it is what he spends it on when he does. Because there is a list, and the list is short, and almost everything on it points toward the same place once the pattern becomes visible. The anchor house on the ocean floor, where Krabs lives with his daughter Pearl, is not, by the standards of Bikini Bottom real estate, a modest dwelling. It is large enough to accommodate a teenage sperm whale with a full social life, which requires a certain amount of square footage that a genuinely cheap person might resist paying for. The building itself, a retired ship anchor repurposed as a residential structure, was acquired at some point in the show's backstory, under circumstances the series never specifies in detail, but it functions in every episode as a permanent, owned property rather than a rented one. No landlord appears, no mortgage payment is ever mentioned as a financial stress. The anchor is simply there, fully Krabs's, a piece of real estate that belongs to him in the same uncomplicated way the Krusty Krab building does, purchased outright and held without ongoing cost. What the anchor costs to maintain and operate is another matter. Pearl's bedroom alone, glimpsed across various episodes, reflects the preferences of a teenager who has not been raised under the same austere financial philosophy her father applies to everything outside the home. The room has the furniture and decoration of a young person whose needs have generally been met, not extravagantly by any standard visible in the show, but not stripped down to the minimum that Krabs applies everywhere else either. Pearl exists, within the household, as the exception to the rule that governs every other financial decision Krabs makes. She is the place where the calculator stops. The show has returned to this dynamic across dozens of episodes, and it holds consistently across the full run, even as Krabs' behavior toward nearly every other character in the series grows more extreme in the later seasons. Pearl wants something, Krabs resists, sometimes at length and with considerable theatrical distress about the cost. But in episode after episode, when the moment of actual decision arrives, when the choice between money and Pearl becomes concrete rather than theoretical, Krabs chooses Pearl. The resistance is real, and the complaints about cost are genuine expressions of pain rather than purely performed reluctance. But they are not the final answer. The final answer, across the full history of the show, is almost always some version of giving Pearl what she needs. The episode that makes this pattern most explicit is Whale of a Birthday, from season 4, which builds its entire premise around Krabs' attempt to throw Pearl a 16th birthday party on the absolute minimum possible budget. The failures that follow are built around his specific attempts to substitute cheap alternatives for everything Pearl has actually asked for, renting an ancient, broken-down entertainment system instead of a modern one, hiring a band Pearl has never heard of instead of her favorite artists, replacing real party food food with the cheapest available version of every item. Each substitution is carefully calibrated to look like the real thing from a distance and reveal itself as a disappointment at close range, which is a fairly precise description of how financial anxiety operates when it tries to perform generosity without actually spending anything. SpongeBob, watching all of this unfold and understanding what it means for Pearl, uses the restaurant's earnings for the day to give the party what Krabs' budget could not. The episode ends with Pearl getting the birthday she wanted, SpongeBob having spent real money to make it happen, and Krabs reacting to the discovery that the day's takings are gone, with his standard response to financial loss. But the episode's emotional weight sits on Pearl's happiness rather than on Krabs' loss, and the show's framing makes clear which of those outcomes the audience is supposed to care about. Mrs. Puff occupies a separate category in Krabs' spending behavior, one that arrived relatively late in the show's run, but developed into something the series took seriously enough to revisit across multiple seasons. The romantic relationship between Krabs and SpongeBob's boating instructor began formally in the Season 2 episode Krusty Love, which is also the episode that gives the clearest single picture of what happens to Krabs' financial restraint when his feelings for another person are genuinely engaged. The episode establishes that Krabs, having developed feelings for Mrs. Puff after a chance meeting, finds himself unable to stop spending money on her in a way that horrifies him even as he continues doing it. He keeps handing SpongeBob money to go buy things for Mrs. Puff on his behalf, then immediately regretting each purchase and screaming at SpongeBob for spending the money he just handed over. A loop of compulsive generosity, followed by panicked regret that the episode plays as a direct expression of what it feels like to want to spend on someone you care about when spending on anyone is genuinely painful. The specific items Krabs buys for Mrs. Puff across that episode accumulate into a list that is notable primarily because it represents the longest recorded instance of Krabs voluntarily spending money on another person outside his immediate family in the show's entire history. Flowers, chocolates, jewelry, a new hat, dinner. Each purchase triggers a fresh wave of anguish that the episode voices loudly and then immediately overrides with the next purchase, suggesting that what is happening is not a rational weighing of cost against benefit, but something operating below that level entirely, an impulse toward generosity that his normal financial architecture cannot contain once it has been activated by the right person. Krusty Love ends with Mrs. Puff confronting Krabs about the mixed signals he has been sending, confused by the pattern of extravagant gifts, followed by what appears to be immediate regret about each one. The conversation that follows is one of the more honest emotional moments the show gives Krabs across its entire run. He explains, without his usual deflection into financial complaint, that spending money on her does not feel the way spending money normally feels to him. The episode uses this as a comedy beat, landing on a joke rather than a tender resolution, but the information delivered in that beat is genuine character information rather than purely set up for a gag. Krabs does not experience the cost of what he buys for Mrs. Puff the way he experiences every other cost. Whatever the mechanism is that makes spending money feel like physical pain to him in every other context operates differently when she is the recipient. Outside Pearl and Mrs. Puff, the list of things Mr. Krabs voluntarily spends money on grows considerably shorter, and most of what remains on it connects back to the restaurant in some form. He invests in equipment when the investment has a clear and calculable return. He spends on renovation or rebranding when he believes the upgrade will generate enough additional revenue to justify the outlay, which is why the various rebranding episodes across the show's run, the Cuddly Crab, the Krusty Sponge, the Krusty Towers hotel conversion, all begin with a calculation about profit rather than any interest in the experience the customer is having. He buys things for the restaurant that he then charges his employees to use, which is a category of spending that is really a form of revenue generation wearing the costume of an expense. And he spends on legal fees and settlements when his behavior crosses whatever line Bikini Bottom's justice system is capable of enforcing on a given day, which happens often enough across the show's run that it represents a meaningful recurring cost line in the Krusty Krab's actual operating budget. There is one more category of Krabs' spending that appears less frequently but carries enough narrative weight to be worth noting, and it is the category that the show uses most deliberately to argue that the character is not purely the sum of his worst financial behaviors. Across the show's run, there are moments, not many, but enough to form a pattern, where Krabs spends money not because the expenditure serves any financial purpose, and not because Pearl or Mrs. Puff is involved, but because something he recognizes as right has presented itself at a cost he could technically avoid paying. These moments are small, usually played quickly, and almost always walk back their own emotional generosity before the end of the episode in order to preserve the character's comedic identity. But they are there, and the show puts them there with enough consistency across enough seasons that they seem intentional rather than accidental. The episode Rockabye Bivalve, in which SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a baby scallop and Krabs plays no significant role, is not where this pattern lives. The pattern lives in the quieter moments inside episodes primarily about something else, where Krabs makes a choice that costs him money, and the episode does not fully undercut it. The Season 3 episode Nasty Patty contains a version of this, in which Krabs and SpongeBob cooperate to manage a crisis they created together, with Krabs making choices throughout the episode that prioritize avoiding harm to a third party over protecting his own financial position, at least until the episode's final reversal. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie contains a version of this in its final act, where Krabs' restored good standing after SpongeBob saves Bikini Bottom leads him to make a public appointment that costs him something he had been holding on to for the entire film. What this spending portrait, assembled across the full run of the show, actually reveals about the character is something the official net worth calculation and the fan financial analyses both miss, because both of those exercises are trying to count money, and the thing the spending pattern reveals is not countable. The places Mr. Krabs spends money are the places he loves. The absolute floor beneath his financial anxiety, the thing that cannot be converted into a line on a spreadsheet, is Pearl. Just below that floor is Mrs. Puff. Below that, distantly and inconsistently but genuinely, is SpongeBob, who the show suggests Krabs loves in the specific way a person loves someone they take for granted until they are gone, which is a kind of love the show demonstrates more through Krabs' behavior when SpongeBob is absent than through anything he says when SpongeBob is present. The Selling Out episode, discussed in an earlier section of this video as a data point for the Krusty Krab's market value, reveals something about spending as well. Krabs sells the restaurant, he takes the money, he retires. And within what the episode implies is a very short stretch of time, he is bored in a way that money cannot resolve, desperate to return to work in a building he just sold, willing to take a job as an employee in the corporate version of his own restaurant just to have somewhere to be. The money from the sale does not make retirement feel like what he spent his working life imagining it would feel like. The money never does. Every time the show gives Krabs a large enough sum to step back from the daily pressure of running the Krusty Krab, he finds a way back to the restaurant, because the restaurant is not just where the money comes from. It is where he is himself, the version of himself that is not the child in the dumpster clothes, and no amount deposited anywhere could replicate what standing in that building every morning actually provides. Understanding Mr. Krabs' spending is ultimately less about tracking where the money goes than about tracking what the money is for. Pearl gets it because she is the reason the whole system needs to keep running. Mrs. Puff gets it because she is the person who found a way through the armor that the whole system is built to maintain. The restaurant gets it because the restaurant is the proof, renewed daily, that the system worked. And almost nothing else gets it because almost nothing else is the point. The official net worth figure of $5 million, the fan estimates stretching into the hundreds of millions, the cash in the safe, and the coins in the bath, all of it is being held in place by those three things, pointed at them, justified by them, and ultimately unable to fully express them in the currency it was built to handle. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The few things Mr. Krabs spends money on point directly to the few things he actually loves, and the list is shorter than anyone who has watched the show would probably guess. Next comes the other side of his financial history, the episodes that document not what he earns or spends, but what he has done to other people in the name of keeping every cent he has. Section 8, the criminal record. Every business owner makes choices that sit in a gray area, pricing decisions that push against what feels fair, cost-cutting measures that benefit the bottom line at someone else's expense, small acts of creative accounting that technically fall within the rules while operating as close to the edge of them as possible without crossing over. This is not what this section is about. This section is about the other list, the one the show has been quietly building across 25 years of episodes, the documented instances where Mr. Krabs did not approach a line and stop or find a clever way around it, but simply walked through it, in full view of the audience, often in full view of other characters within the show, and kept walking. The list is longer than most people who watch the series casually would expect, and it covers a wider range of categories than the standard portrait of Krabs as a lovably greedy cartoon villain tends to acknowledge. The most direct entry point into this list is the labor record, because labor is where the show has always been most comfortable letting Krabs cross from comedy into something that requires a different word. The episode Squid on Strike from Season 2 has already been covered in this video in the context of wages, but its most significant element for the purposes of this section is not the bills Krabs presents to his employees on payday, it is the specific charges listed on those bills. Standing while on the job, breathing while on the job, existing in the vicinity of the building. These are not exaggerated descriptions of policy positions the show treats as technically permissible within Bikini Bottom's legal framework. They are the show's most concentrated statement of what Krabs would do to his employees if nothing stopped him, presented without any in-episode consequence that meaningfully changes his behavior in subsequent episodes. The fine for existing is a joke. The underlying question it raises about whether any legal framework in Bikini Bottom is capable of preventing it is less funny the longer it sits. Fear of a Krabby Patty from Season 4 addresses the labor question from a different angle and arrives at a conclusion that sits closer to what labor law in most real-world jurisdictions would classify as serious violation territory. The premise involves Plankton engineering a situation where the Krusty Krab is forced to open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as part of a longer scheme to exhaust SpongeBob through overwork and separate him from the kitchen long enough to steal the formula. Krabs, presented with the opportunity to run the restaurant around the clock and therefore generate additional revenue, does not question the arrangement or express any concern about what continuous operation means for his two employees. He embraces it completely. SpongeBob and Squidward work without rest for a period the episode eventually places at 43 consecutive days, a number the show states explicitly, rather than leaving vague. 43 days of continuous operation, no days off, no rest periods, no acknowledgement from their employer that the human body, or the octopus and sponge bodies that serve the same function in this show, has limits that the employment relationship is obligated to respect. SpongeBob eventually suffers a breakdown severe enough that Plankton's own plan is derailed by it, which functions as the episode's resolution, but does not involve any consequence for Krabs relating to the conditions that produced the breakdown in the first place. The episode The Krusty Sponge, which has already appeared in this video in the context of Gene Scallop, contains a sequence that moves further along the spectrum from labor violation into territory the show explicitly frames as criminal. When Squidward, substituting in the kitchen while SpongeBob drives the restaurant's new promotional train ride, begins serving patties that have not been properly stored, Mr. Krabs is aware something is wrong before the customers start getting sick. The episode establishes this awareness through his response when SpongeBob attempts to warn him, which is to lock himself in his office with the day's profits, rather than address what is happening on the dining room floor. When customers begin to show the effects of food poisoning in numbers large enough that the restaurant has visibly become a crisis scene, Krabs is still in his office. The episode resolves with his arrest and trial, a conviction, and a sentence that the presiding judge commutes in exchange for a ride on the fun train, which is a comedic outcome, but one that arrives only after the show has put a food poisoning mass casualty event, a criminal arrest, and a guilty verdict on Mr. Krabs' explicit record within the show's own continuity. The Jellyfish Hunter episode, from Season 2, approaches the criminal record question from a direction that has less to do with labor and more to do with the environment of Bikini Bottom itself, and what it documents about Krabs' behavior in that direction is among the most serious things the show has ever attributed to him within a single episode. The premise begins innocuously enough, with SpongeBob's passion for jellyfish crossing into the Krusty Krab's menu development when Mr. Krabs discovers that jellyfish jelly is both delicious and commercially viable. He adds it to the menu. Customers respond enthusiastically. Revenue increases. At this point, the episode is running a standard Krabs storyline, the discovery of a profitable product, followed by an attempt to maximize that product's output as quickly as possible. The turn arrives when SpongeBob, the person doing the jellyfish catching, proves unable to catch them fast enough to satisfy the demand Krabs is generating. Krabs solves this problem himself, at night, without telling SpongeBob what he is doing or where the increasing supply is coming from. What Krabs is doing, at night, is capturing jellyfish by the thousands and imprisoning them in a factory he has built secretly beneath the Krusty Krab, where they are mechanically harvested for their jelly in conditions the episode frames explicitly as abusive. The jellyfish are not treated as a renewable resource being managed responsibly. They are being extracted at a rate the episode eventually establishes is sufficient to drive the entire jellyfish population of Bikini Bottom toward collapse, a consequence SpongeBob discovers when he follows the trail of captured jellyfish to the underground factory and finds the operation Krabs has been running. The episode ends with intervention from a giant blue jellyfish that represents the species as a whole. The factory is destroyed, and Krabs is forced to stop. No legal consequence follows. No external authority becomes involved. The near extinction of an entire entire species of animal, native to Bikini Bottom, driven entirely by one business owner's decision to prioritize short-term revenue over the sustainability of his supply chain, is resolved through the actions of a single cartoon sponge rather than through anything resembling regulatory enforcement. Nasty Patty, also from Season 3, adds a different entry to the record. The episode's premise hinges on Krabs and SpongeBob being deceived into believing a health inspector visiting the restaurant is a fraud impersonating the real one, an assumption they form based on a news report they misunderstand. Operating on this belief, they decide to serve the inspector a deliberately contaminated patty, which they prepare with that specific intention, and deliver to him knowing what is in it. The episode later reveals that the inspector was legitimate after all, and the entire rest of the runtime follows from the consequences of that misunderstanding. But the specific act of deliberately preparing and serving food that has been intentionally made harmful to the person consuming it, regardless of who that person turns out to be, is documented within the episode as something Krabs and SpongeBob chose to do. The show frames it as dark comedy rather than crime, and the episode's resolution is played for laughs rather than for justice, but the decision itself is recorded. Penny Foolish, from Season 6, is worth including in this section not because it involves violence or mass harm, but because of what it documents about the specific form Krabs' financial obsession takes when it encounters a small enough denomination of money. The episode's premise is built entirely around Krabs' conviction that SpongeBob has found a penny, not a large sum, not a meaningful amount by any economic measure. A single penny, 1 cent, the smallest unit of the currency the show uses. Krabs' response to this conviction, which he maintains across the entire episode despite SpongeBob's consistent denial that any penny was found, involves a sustained campaign of surveillance, manipulation, and ultimately physical trespass that the episode documents methodically. He builds an elaborate fake movie theater to lure SpongeBob into an environment where he might produce the penny. He installs monitoring equipment. He digs up SpongeBob's yard. The episode ends with the penny revealed to have been a piece of chewing gum, meaning SpongeBob was telling the truth across the entire episode, and with Krabs still digging in the yard anyway because he has not accepted the conclusion. The digging continues after SpongeBob has discovered a $500 bill in the same location, looked at it, and thrown it away. A reversal the show uses to make a point about the specific blindness that comes with fixating on a small thing at the expense of seeing what is actually there. The Krusty Krab training video episode, which functions within the show's continuity as an in-universe corporate training document rather than a standard narrative episode, contains a moment that sits outside the usual framing of Krabs' financial behavior because it is delivered not as a joke requiring a setup and a punchline, but as simple information delivered in a documentary tone. The episode establishes, through the training video's own narration, that the Krusty Krab charges customers a standing fee simply for being in the building, a policy Krabs describes not as an unusual or controversial practice, but as a standard feature of doing business at his restaurant. The standing fee is not presented as something customers are informed of before entering. It appears to be collected as a matter of course, added to bills without prior notice. As a routine operating practice, the staff is expected to support rather than question. The broader pattern that emerges from assembling these episodes into a single record is one that the show's own critics have addressed over the years, particularly in the context of how Krabs' behavior changed between the show's early seasons and the later ones. Critical assessments of the show's second, third, and fourth seasons generally treat Krabs' greed as a comic trait that the writing uses with enough restraint to keep the character sympathetic alongside the comedy. The greed produces situations that are funny because they are absurd, and because the show's structure consistently prevents Krabs from getting away with the worst of it without some form of consequence, even if that consequence is comic rather than legal. In the later seasons, the same critical consensus holds that the restraint weakens, the behavior escalates past points the earlier seasons would not have crossed, and the consequences become increasingly inadequate relative to what Krabs has done to generate them. Former showrunner Paul Tibbitt has spoken publicly about the character dynamics he valued most in the show's earlier years, and that commentary exists alongside a broader critical and fan acknowledgement that something in the show's treatment of Krabs shifted over time in ways that were not universally welcomed. What the criminal record, assembled across the full run rather than season by season, actually demonstrates is something that sits at the center of any serious assessment of what Mr. Krabs is worth and what that worth means. Every item on the list is connected to money in some direct and traceable way. The 43-day forced labor stretch was designed to generate more sales. The food poisoning mass event happened because Krabs locked himself in the office with the day's profits, rather than address what was happening outside it. The jellyfish factory was built to maximize production of a profitable product beyond the point the supply could sustain. The penny digging was because a cent is still a cent. The standing fee is because every moment a body occupies space in the building is a moment that can theoretically be converted into revenue. The record is not the record of a person who does harmful things for complex or mixed reasons, or who is sometimes cruel in ways that are incidental to the primary goal. It is the record of a person who follows a single calculation with remarkable consistency across an enormous range of situations, and whose capacity to cause harm to the people and creatures around him scales directly with how clearly he can connect the harm to a financial benefit. The child who grew up poor, who built something real from nothing, who traded his body for a single dollar and his employee's soul for 62 cents, has spent decades demonstrating that the gap between those early experiences and the present accumulated wealth has not changed the calculation. There is always more to get. There is always something that can be converted into a number, and the number, once arrived at, is always worth whatever was required to reach it. The show has never fully resolved whether this is a portrait of a villain or of a person. The answer it gives across its best episodes is that the distinction matters less than the pattern, and the pattern is complete enough, documented thoroughly enough across enough seasons and enough situations to constitute a record that any honest accounting of Mr. Krabs' wealth needs to sit next to. What he has is real. How he got it, and what he was willing to do along the way, is equally real. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the show has always been most interesting when it is willing to let both of them be visible in the same scene. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The criminal record is long and consistent, and it connects directly to the money at every entry on the list. The final two sections of this video step back from the individual episodes and ask the larger question that all of it points toward: what the wealth actually means inside the show's own moral framework, and what the real answer to the title question turns out to be. Section 9. What the money is really for. Sometime around the midpoint of the show's run, critics who had been following SpongeBob SquarePants since its debut started noticing something about Mr. Krabs that was difficult to articulate cleanly, but easy to feel across enough episodes. The greed had always been the point of the character. The greed was what made him funny, what gave him a consistent motivation across hundreds of episodes, what distinguished him from the gentler, more accommodating versions of authority figures that populate most children's television. But somewhere in the middle seasons, for a stretch of episodes, something about the greed started to feel different. Not louder exactly, because it had always been loud. Different in kind rather than volume. The laugh that was supposed to arrive at the end of his worst moments started taking slightly longer to come, and for some viewers in some episodes it stopped arriving at all. Understanding why that happened, and what it reveals about the deeper architecture of the character, requires stepping back from the individual episode record and asking a question the show itself only answers indirectly. What is the money actually for? Not in the sense of what Krabs says it is for, since he says it is simply the point, the goal, the measure of everything worth measuring, but in the sense of what function the accumulation of wealth actually serves in his life, what problem it is solving, what absence it is filling, what version of the future it is building toward, and whether that future ever arrives. The answer the show gives across its full run is not the answer a straightforward reading of Krabs as a greedy character would suggest. A greedy character in the simplest sense of that description is one who wants more, because more is better, and better is always the direction worth moving in. Greed in that uncomplicated form does not produce the specific behaviors the show has attached to Mr. Krabs. Pure, uncomplicated greed at the level Krabs operates would have produced a much richer man by now, because the Krusty Krab's structural advantages are real enough and sustained enough that a person simply maximizing revenue without the behavioral quirks the show gives Krabs would have accumulated significantly more wealth by this point in the show's timeline than any estimate of his current holdings suggests. The money bath, the penny stocking, the 62-cent soul purchase, the fake currency payroll system, none of these behaviors are efficient ways to maximize wealth. They are something else wearing the costume of wealth maximization. What they actually are, assembled across the full run and read against the childhood backstory the show provides, is a set of rituals. The money bath is not a rational use of accumulated cash. No financial advisor would recommend keeping significant liquid assets in a pile on the office floor, where they can be rolled in and handled and felt against the skin. As a method of storing value, it is genuinely terrible, vulnerable to loss, impossible to audit, generating no returns, and requiring the owner to spend meaningful time in physical contact with his savings in order to derive anything from them. As a ritual, it makes complete sense. It is a child who once held a single dollar and loved it, demonstrating, daily, that the single dollar has multiplied beyond any version of itself the child could have imagined. The rolling and the touching and the bathing are not irrational. They are the specific form of reassurance that a man shaped by that childhood needs in order to feel the money as real, rather rather than simply knowing it exists somewhere on a balance sheet. The penny stocking that runs across episodes like Penny Foolish operates on the same logic from a different angle. A rational maximizer of wealth does not spend an entire episode pursuing a single cent. The time and energy and elaborate theater of fake movie screenings and surveillance equipment required to recover a penny costs orders of magnitude more than a penny is worth by any reasonable calculation of opportunity cost. But the penny is not the point. The point is that something of monetary value exists in the world and is not in his possession, and the existence of that gap is something his nervous system cannot tolerate, regardless of how small the gap is. The size of the coin is irrelevant. The condition of incompleteness is what produces the behavior, and the behavior will continue until the condition is resolved, even when resolving it costs more than the thing being recovered is worth. This is not greed in any simple form. This is closer to compulsion, a pattern of behavior that runs independently of the rational calculation it appears to be based on. The show's own writers seem to have understood this distinction, at least in the early and middle seasons, and the episodes that make Krabs most fully dimensional as a character are the ones that let the distinction be visible. Born-Again Krabs works as well as it does not because Krabs' cheapness produces a funny situation, though it does, but because the episode takes the cheapness seriously enough to ask what it would mean for someone to spend an entire life operating this way, and then answers that question by having a supernatural authority figure show up and say plainly that the answer is Davy Jones's locker. The Flying Dutchman is not positioned in that episode as someone making an unreasonable claim. His assessment of Krabs' life, delivered before the Soul Sale and independent of it, is presented as accurate. The charge is cheapness, and the episode's structure validates the charge before Krabs even has the opportunity to confirm it by selling SpongeBob for 62 cents. Clams, from the same season, offers a different angle on the same underlying question. The episode's Moby Dick structure is not accidental. Herman Melville's story is specifically about a man whose obsessive pursuit of a single object has consumed everything else in his life, who cannot stop even when stopping is clearly the rational choice, who drags everyone around him into the pursuit regardless of whether they want to be there or what it costs them. The millionth dollar is, within the episode's own framing, every Krabs' life goal. Krabs has spent his entire working life building toward that specific milestone. When it is taken from him within minutes of achieving it, his response is not grief or frustration in the ordinary sense. It is a complete psychological collapse, followed by a reorganization of his entire personality around recovery of the lost object at any cost. He uses SpongeBob and Squidward as bait for a giant sea creature. He trades his own body, piece by piece, for the return of a single dollar bill. He emerges from the mouth of a clam with one arm and his head and the dollar he went in to retrieve, and the episode plays this as a triumph rather than a cautionary tale, which is its own form of comment on what a life spent in pursuit of a specific number looks like from the inside versus from the outside. The show has returned to this theme across different episodes using different structures, and the consistency of the underlying argument is more visible in retrospect than it was episode by episode. The episode Rockabye Bivalve, where SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a baby scallop, contains no Krabs material worth noting for this section. The episode Selling Out, however, contains exactly the material this section needs, because it is the one time in the show's run where Krabs actually achieves what the surface-level reading of his character suggests he wants. He sells the restaurant for a large sum of money, he retires. He has the wealth, converted from the business into liquid form, and he has the freedom from daily obligation that the wealth was supposedly being built to purchase. He has, in other words, the outcome. And the outcome lasts approximately the length of a single episode before he is back inside a building that used to be his, working as an employee under management that bought his life's work and immediately began destroying what made it valuable. The lesson the show draws from that episode, delivered through the plot rather than through any character explicitly stating it, is not the one a straightforward reading of the premise would suggest. A story about a greedy man who sells his business and then misses it could be a story about the value of work over wealth, a fairly conventional moral that children's television reaches for regularly. The episode runs that moral, but undercuts it immediately by having Krabs return to the restaurant not because he misses the work in any pure sense, but because he needs to be the owner. The specific thing retirement removes from him is not the cooking or the management or the daily contact with customers. It is the position, the role, the identity of being the person who runs the most successful restaurant in Bikini Bottom, which is the identity he built over decades to replace the one he started with, the child in the dumpster clothes who nobody wanted to sit with. The money was never going to be enough, because the money was never the actual goal. The goal, shaped in a schoolyard, in whatever decade Bikini Bottom's timeline places that period, was to never again be the person who could be dismissed, excluded, or looked down on because of what he could not afford. That That goal has no completion point. There is no number large enough to guarantee that the schoolyard condition is permanently resolved, because the schoolyard condition was not actually about the number. It was about the position, the sense of being seen, and treated as someone whose presence in the room carries weight. The restaurant provides that daily. The money in the safe provides it in a different form. The penny in the neighbor's yard threatens it in miniature, and the threat is enough to activate the full machinery of recovery, regardless of the penny's objective value. This reading of the character, which the show supports across its best episodes without ever stating it explicitly, changes how the number this video is built around actually lands. Whatever Mr. Krabs is worth, whether it is the official 5 million, or the fan-estimated hundreds of millions, or some larger figure that includes the formula, and the cash in the safe, and the property, and the cumulative decades of labor cost savings, the number does not tell the story the title question seems to be asking. The question, how much money does Mr. Krabs really have, sounds like a question about accounting. The answer the show gives, across 25 years of episodes, is that it is a question about something the accounting cannot reach. The show has one more piece of evidence to offer on this point, and it comes from an unlikely source. In the Season 3 episode The Sponge Who Could Fly, which takes the form of a lost episode presented within the show's own framing, Krabs is given a brief moment that the episode does not build around or draw attention to, but simply includes. SpongeBob, in the middle of whatever situation the episode has constructed around him, needs help. Krabs provides it. The provision of help costs Krabs something, not much, but something, and the episode does not undercut the moment with a joke about the cost or a subsequent reversal where Krabs reclaims what he spent. It simply moves on. The moment is small enough to miss if attention is elsewhere, and the show's structure treats it as unremarkable, which is the episode's own comment on what it represents. Krabs helping someone at a small cost to himself is not, in the show's view of its own character, impossible or even particularly surprising. It is simply rare enough to register and common enough to not require explanation. The rarity is the thing, not the impossibility. The show has never argued that Krabs is incapable of generosity or that the cheapness is the whole person. What it has argued, across every season and every iteration of the character, is that the cheapness is the dominant mode, the setting the character returns to between exceptions, the default state that every other quality in him operates in tension with, rather than alongside comfortably. Pearl is an exception the show has built its entire portrait of Krabs' humanity around. Mrs. Puff is an exception that arrived later and revealed something the earlier seasons had not fully explored. SpongeBob is an exception that the show administers in doses small enough to keep the comedy functional, appearing most clearly in the moments immediately after Krabs has done something genuinely indefensible, and the episode needs a way to suggest that the relationship between employer and employee is not entirely transactional. What Mr. Krabs really has, then, and what the title question finally resolves into after 9 sections of evidence, is this. He has a business worth somewhere between $5 million and several $100 million, depending on how the methodology is applied. He has a formula that may be his most valuable single asset, and whose true worth is genuinely incalculable, given that its full contents may not be fully known to any living person. He has property owned outright, cash held physically in forms that do not generate returns, but provide a different kind of value. He has a daughter who will inherit all of it, which is perhaps the clearest statement the show ever makes about what the accumulation is ultimately pointed at. And underneath all of that, running older and deeper than any of the numbers, he has the specific fear that built him. The boy from the dumpster clothes, who found a penny at a carnival and understood for the first time what pennies could become. That boy is still running the calculation. He will still be running it in the final episode of whatever season comes next. And the number he arrives at will still not be the one he is actually looking for, because the number he is actually looking for does not exist in any currency Bikini Bottom has ever printed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The money was never going to be enough, and the show has known that since the first season. The final section brings everything together and delivers the only real answer the title question has ever had. Section 10, the real answer. A number, arrived at through careful methodology, accounting for the restaurant and the formula and the property and the cash in the safe and the decades of compounding labor cost savings, presented with enough supporting detail to feel like a genuine resolution. The number would sit there, defensible and specific, and that would be that. Eugene Harold Krabs, born November 30th, 1942, to a family whose clothes came from a dumpster, worth X dollars, as of the current season of a cartoon that has been running since 1999. File closed. The career of Eugene Krabs, read from beginning to end and taken seriously as a story rather than as a cartoon backdrop for jokes about greed, is one of the more complete self-made narratives in animated television. The boy who was mocked in school for wearing clothes pulled from a dumpster, who had one friend and lost that friend to the same ambition that would eventually define both of them, who joined the Navy and cooked for sailors on ships with undignified names, and came home to a period of depression that the show describes without fully dramatizing, actually built the thing. The Krusty Krab exists. It has existed, continuously, as the dominant food establishment in Bikini Bottom, across the entirety of the show's run. The formula has stayed protected through every attempt made against it, and there have been hundreds of those attempts, across hundreds of episodes. The millionth dollar was earned and celebrated and then swallowed by a clam, and recovered through a transaction that required Krabs to trade most of his own body for a single bill, which is its own form of testament to how completely the goal had become everything. The $5 million official net worth is real. The structural case for a figure many times larger than that is sound enough that serious analysts have committed to it in writing. All of that is genuinely impressive, not morally uncomplicated, because the record of how it was built contains enough labor violations and food safety disasters and outright criminal behavior to fill a separate video entirely. But impressive in the way that any sustained achievement built from nothing against significant odds is impressive, regardless of the methods involved. The child from the dumpster clothes made himself into the wealthiest resident of Bikini Bottom and held that position across decades of continuous operation. That is not nothing. What the show has spent 25 years asking, underneath every joke and every absurd cheapness gag and every soul sale and every money bath, is what it cost. And the cost is not the kind that appears on any ledger. The clearest way to see what was paid is to look at what is missing. Across 2.5 decades of episodes, the social landscape around Mr. Krabs is notably sparse for a character who has been the dominant commercial presence in his community for his entire adult life. He does not have friends in the way the show's other characters have friends. SpongeBob has Patrick, a relationship the show has built into something genuinely affecting across its best episodes, a friendship that functions as the emotional center of the entire series. Sandy has scientific colleagues and a genuine intellectual life that the restaurant does not touch. Even Squidward, defined by his failure to connect with the people immediately around him, has the ghost of former relationships. The rivalry with Squilliam that implies a shared history of ambition and competition. The brief moments where his clarinet playing suggests an inner life that goes somewhere the Krusty Krab cannot reach. Krabs has the restaurant. He has Pearl. He has Mrs. Puff, arriving later in the show's run, and representing something the character had not been given before, a person who reached him through the armor rather than bouncing off it. Outside those three things, the human texture of his life is thin in a way that reads less as a writing oversight and more as a deliberate portrait of what happens when a single organizing principle crowds out everything else over a long enough period of time. The town has been feeding him its money for decades. The town does not know him. Pearl is where the portrait becomes most honest about itself, because Pearl is the exception that makes the rule visible by contrast. Every piece of financial discipline that governs every other relationship in Krabs' life suspends itself when Pearl enters the frame. The calculator that runs underneath everything, converting situations into numbers and numbers into decisions, goes quiet. Or rather, it keeps running but stops governing the outcome, which is a different and more interesting thing. Krabs knows what Pearl's birthday party costs. He knows it the way he knows the price of everything, with a precision and a physical discomfort that the show makes visible across the entirety of Whale of a Birthday. He knows it, and he pays it anyway, eventually, because the alternative is not a financial outcome he can calculate his way into accepting. There is no version of the math that produces Pearl's disappointment as an acceptable result. The inheritance plan, confirmed in the SpongeBob musical, is perhaps the most quietly significant piece of financial information the show has ever delivered about this character. More significant than the millionth dollar, and more significant than the 62 cents, because it is the one moment in the entire portrait where the accumulation has a destination. Everything else Krabs does with money is oriented toward the present tense, protecting what exists, preventing loss, recovering what was taken, converting the world around him into numbers, and then making sure the numbers stay in his possession. The future, in that framework, is not a place the money is going. It is a threat, the direction from which the next loss might arrive. Pearl changes that. Pearl is the future the money is going to, the proof that the accumulation has always been pointed somewhere, rather than simply growing in place. The child of the man from the dumpster clothes is going to inherit a business empire. She is going to take ownership of the most successful restaurant in Bikini Bottom, built on a formula that has survived every attempt to take it, housed in a building owned outright, staffed by the best fry cook in the ocean's recorded history. That is what 40 years of watching every penny and charging for breathing and selling souls for 62 cents was building toward. Not comfort for himself, because the show makes clear across the selling out episode and its immediate aftermath that comfort for himself is is not something he knows how to accept. For her, the parallel with Plankton has been part of the show's background since the first episode, and it becomes more pointed the longer it runs. Because the longer it runs, the clearer it becomes that the two of them are not a hero and a villain in any clean sense, but two versions of the same starting point that diverged at one moment and then spent decades locked in the consequences of that divergence. Same school, same poverty, same exclusion, same birthday, same initial ambition to build something that would prove the schoolyard wrong. The recipe accident sent one of them home with the effective formula and one of them home with a pinch of chum, and everything that followed flows from that single outcome. Plankton's life, read against Krabs's, is the clearest picture the show has of what the absence of financial success does to a person shaped by the same original wound. He is not free. He is not philosophical about his circumstances. He has not found a different way to understand what success means, or built a life around values that the Krusty Krab's dominance cannot touch. He has spent every year of his adult life across the street, failing in the same direction, scheming against the same target, being defeated, and resetting and beginning again with the same objective. His intelligence is extraordinary. His technical capability has produced inventions that any serious scientist would find remarkable. In a different life, with a different ingredient, or a different choice about where to direct that capability, he might have built something entirely separate from the Krusty Krab's shadow. He never does. The shadow is where he lives. The comparison matters because it provides the only real external baseline for what Krabs's wealth has actually done for him. Plankton without the money is miserable in a specific, sustained, documentable way. Krabs with the money is not happy in any simple sense, but he is functional, purposeful, structurally capable of the exceptions that make a life feel like something more than a single sustained reaction to a childhood wound. He has Pearl. He has the restaurant. He has the daily ritual of the money bath, which is not happiness, but is something. The specific reassurance that a man shaped by his history would need in order to feel the accumulation as real, rather than simply knowing it exists somewhere. The absence of financial success has not liberated Plankton into a different relationship with what matters. It has trapped him in a loop. The presence of financial success has not liberated Krabs either, but it has given him enough structure to build something that the loop cannot entirely consume. That is not an endorsement of the methods. The forced labor, the food poisoning, the jellyfish factory, the breathing charges, the 62 cents, the contaminated patty he tried to serve before eating himself out of an inability to throw away something with theoretical commercial value. None of those things become acceptable because the outcome they contributed to includes Pearl and Mrs. Puff and a formula that has stayed protected across decades. The record is the record. The archive of behavior the show has built around this character over 25 seasons is not flattering, and the later seasons push it to points where the show's own structure struggles to contain the darkness inside the comedy frame it was built for. That tension is real and worth naming rather than explaining away. But the record also includes the moments where something else comes through, and those moments are specific enough and consistent enough across enough seasons that they cannot be written off as accidents of scripting or sentimentality inserted against the character's grain. The remorse at the end of Born Again Krabs is real, even though it does not last. The spending on Mrs. Puff in Krusty Love is genuine generosity, even though it is accompanied by so much visible anguish that it barely resembles what generosity usually looks like. The choice to appoint SpongeBob as manager of the Krusty Krab 2 at the end of the first film, in front of a crowd, after SpongeBob has done something that cost him more than Krabs could reasonably have expected or asked, is a real acknowledgement of real worth, delivered publicly and without the subsequent reversal that similar moments in other episodes tend to collect. The character who does those things is the same character who sold SpongeBob's soul for 62 cents. The show has always insisted on both of those being true simultaneously, and its best episodes are the ones that hold both without resolving the tension into something cleaner than it actually is. SpongeBob is the last piece of this, and the most important one, because SpongeBob is in every episode. He shows up before he is required to. He stays after the restaurant closes. He has spent his entire documented working life inside an employment relationship that the show has detailed across hundreds of episodes as exploitative in ways ranging from mildly absurd to genuinely troubling, and he has done all of that for a nickel a year, for fake currency, for crusty cash that can only be spent at the place that issued it, for nothing at all in the episodes where the bill he receives on payday charges him more than he was paid for being there. The debates about what SpongeBob's contentment within this arrangement actually means have run through the fandom for years, and they are not going to be settled here, because the show itself does not settle them. There are episodes that support the reading of his contentment as genuine, a person who loves what he does so completely that the financial terms of the arrangement are genuinely secondary to the daily experience of doing it. There are episodes that support darker mediocre readings, where the contentment reads as something the show is asking the audience to find disturbing rather than simply charming, a portrait of a person whose acceptance of mistreatment has become so complete that he no longer registers it as mistreatment. The show puts both readings on the table and leaves them there, which is either a failure of moral clarity or a sophisticated refusal to resolve a genuinely complicated situation into a lesson, depending on how generously the writing is being read. What is not ambiguous is the contribution. Whatever Mr. Krabs is worth, the total includes an enormous and unquantified debt to a sponge who was paid in coins and fiction for work that the show has demonstrated, across every episode where SpongeBob is absent or unavailable, is irreplaceable. The Krusty Krab without SpongeBob at the grill is not the Krusty Krab. It is a building with a formula that nobody present knows how to execute. The formula's value, which is the foundation of the entire enterprise, is not the piece of paper in the jar in the safe. It is the person at the grill every morning who can make the formula into the thing that people will cross town for, wait in lines for, describe in terms that go past ordinary food preference into something that sounds more like need. That person has never been paid what their contribution is worth. The official net worth calculation did not include their contribution as a line item. No accounting framework has a standard method for pricing the loyalty of someone who was sold for 62 cents and showed up the next morning anyway. Eugene Harold Krabs is worth somewhere between $5 million and several $100 million, depending on who is counting and what they are counting. He built that from a bankrupt retirement home and a painted letter and a recipe that may have existed in his family for 8 centuries, or may have been discovered by accident during a childhood argument that ended a friendship. He kept it through every attempt to take it. He paid for it in ways the ledger cannot record, in the social life that did not develop, in the trust that was extended and converted into transactions, in the accumulation of a criminal record that maps almost perfectly onto a list of things he chose to do for money. He pointed it, the whole accumulation, at his daughter, which is the most human thing the show has ever revealed about him, and the thing that makes the rest of it, if not forgivable exactly, then at least comprehensible, as the behavior of a person rather than purely as the mechanism of a joke. The real answer to the title question is not $5 million. It is not $600 million. It is not the formula, which may be worth more than either of those figures as a standalone asset, or the property, owned outright across decades of appreciation, or the cash in the safe that no balance sheet has ever successfully captured. The real answer is that a boy who started with nothing, who understood before he was old enough to understand much else, that the absence of money was the thing that put him on the outside of every room he wanted to be in, built enough to make sure that would never be true again, and then could not stop building, because the feeling of having built enough never arrived, and the show's evidence across 25 years is that it never will. That is what Mr. Krabs really has. Not a number, a life organized around the pursuit of a number that keeps moving, a restaurant that runs, a daughter who will inherit it, an employee who was sold for 62 cents and came back, and somewhere in the anchor house, behind a locked door, in whatever form keeps the old fear at its most manageable distance, a pile of money that is large enough to be genuinely impressive and not large enough to be the thing it was supposed to be. It never is. That is the oldest story the show tells, told through the loudest, most cartoonishly greedy character it has, and told well enough that 25 years later, the question of how much he really has still does not have an answer that fits on a balance sheet. If you enjoyed this video essay, subscribing helps the channel more than you might think. See you in the next one.